Good afternoon and welcome to the TCEQ's SB3 online workshop. My name is Stephanie Lindgren and I will be your moderator today. Please take a moment to click on the attendance form link and the live event Q&A on the right-hand side of the screen and fill it in. If you don't see the Q&A, you can turn it on by clicking the question mark icon in the top right of the screen. Only our presenters will be able to speak at today's webinar. So if you have any questions regarding problems with the webinar, please email pws.help@tceq.texas.gov. And if you have any direct technical questions regarding your facility, please email those questions to pdwepp@tceq.texas.gov, or you can fill out our help form, which I have posted in the Q&A, as well as the email addresses for your questions. I've also posted a link for the slides that you can download to follow along during the webinar. We have two presenters today, Alex Hens and Haley Davidson, both with our Small Business and Local Government Assistance section. We will take 2 10-minute breaks during this presentation and will remain online during the breaks to respond to some of the questions in the Q&A. If you would like to follow along during the presentation, again, I have posted those slides in the Q&A for you to follow along with. Before we start this webinar, I would like to mention that you can receive CEU credits for this webinar today, but you will need an active water license to receive those credits. Finally, I would like to ask if you have any questions regarding the presentation, type it in the Q&A and be specific with your question to the portion of the presentation that it is referring to. The webinar is about a 10 to 20 second delay from when we are speaking to when you hear it. So if you have any questions, please be specific as possible so we can get you an answer as quick as we can. And now I will turn the mic over to Haley. Haley, go ahead and take it away.
Hello and welcome to our Senate Bill 3 Emergency Preparedness Plan webinar. We are happy to have you join us today, and we hope that you will learn something from today's webinar. I am going to start by giving some basic small business and local government assistance information, and then Alex will dive right into Senate Bill 3 and the EPPs. Small Business and Local Government Assistance section of TCEQ, or SBLGA, offers free confidential technical assistance without the threat of enforcement. We have local compliance specialists around the state that are available to help you for free. SBLGA customers range from business owners to members of industry and local governments. We all know these rules can be confusing, and that's why we are here to help you. Our staff work closely with other parts of the agency to look out for our customers' best interest. We consider a small business to be less than 100 employees. We still offer our free confidential assistance to larger companies. However, there are some programs that they may not be eligible for. We focus many of our resources towards assisting smaller businesses and local governments because they are less likely to have the necessary resources to address environmental concerns. On your screen now, you will see a list of some of our programs and activities. I will go into more detail on these programs, but I just want to show you that our staff is available and ready to assist our customers through a variety of avenues. We have a toll-free hotline number that's staffed each day the agency is open. You can confidentially call this hotline number for live assistance. If you get a voicemail after hours or during the lunch hour, please leave a message and our staff will return your call as soon as possible. Our easy-to-use website should also be on your screen now. This web link has special events like this one for the SB3 webinars, advertised with accessible links to guidance documents. You can also visit our compliance specialists in your local regional office or make arrangements for our staff to conduct site visits at your regulated facility. We have a wonderful program called the Environmentor Program, in which environmental professionals volunteer their assistance, knowledge, and time for free to our customers. This program is for our customers who cannot hire a professional that they need and have fewer than 100 employees. A few examples of environmentors should be on your screen now, like consultants, engineers, lawyers, and operators. This is a map of the 254 Texas counties in the TCEQ 16 regions. We have compliance specialists to assist in each of these regions, and some of our regions even have multiple specialists ready to help you. Rural governments and entities face different challenges than some of our metropolitan areas in the state. Jason Robinson is our rural ombudsman, acting as a liaison between our rural entities and the agency. Jason is able to provide the unique perspective of the other side of the fence to the agency. Jason came to us from a small local government himself, giving him firsthand knowledge on the types of challenges that these rural governments face. In some regions of the state, we have small business advisory committees that our staff routinely participate in. These committees provide an opportunity for small business and local governments to participate in the regulatory process, have their issues heard by the agency, stay updated on TCEQ news, and to network with other small business and local government representatives. Anyone is welcome to attend these meetings. In 2017, we created additional GovDelivery groups, like the list you see on your screen now. By using specific media, we can get information out on rule updates and permit releases quickly to a large group of people. The Advocate electronic newsletter is one of the best ways to stay up to date with rule changes, like SB3. All you have to do to sign up is provide us with your name and email, or you can sign up online, and registration is free. We also host workshops and seminars very similar to this webinar we're hosting currently that we will advertise via the Advocate. SBLGA offers many publications and regulatory guidance documents on multimedia issues that are available to you for free. We can send you print and online copies of these resources at your request. Once again, here's our toll-free hotline number and our webpage. I recommend you either take a picture of this screen or add the phone number to your contact list, whatever your preference is.
Thank you, Haley. Alex, we're ready whenever you are.
Okay, let me transition this. Okay, Stephanie, let me know when you can see it in presentation mode, full screen.
Yep, it's full screen. You're ready to go.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Alexander Hinz, and I work for the Small Business and Local Government Assistance section of TCEQ. And so does Haley Davidson. Here's some of our contact information, but I did want to clarify that we do not work in the water supply division, so we don't work in the EPP program. So for example, we're not going to be ones reviewing the EPPs. Our goal is just to help with some outreach and answering some of the technical questions. And so just wanted to make that distinction there. And so we're trying to get out there and get ahead of the curve here because the requirements haven't been around that long, and really just want to make sure that y'all have a basic understanding of Senate Bill 3 and what the EPP requirements are. And again, I don't have my phone number up there, or Haley's for that matter, because we're teleworking, so we're not in the office. very much anymore, and hopefully that'll change sometime in the near future. But even if y'all like to have a phone conversation with us, y'all can just shoot us a quick email, and that's usually the best way to kind of get us, and then we can figure out a good time to make contact. So today we're going to do a PowerPoint presentation for about an hour and 15 minutes, then we'll take a break. And then after the break, I'm going to kind of go through the TCEQ website and show y'all some other websites, some useful resources. And then towards the end, we're actually going to go through the EPP template and just kind of go section by section through that. So we're going to start with a little background and history on EPPs, just in a general sense, and going to talk a lot about Senate Bill 3 and the new EPP requirements. We're also going to talk about the financial waivers, and again, I'll show y'all how to locate various resources to help you out with this EPP process. Little background in history: during Hurricane Ike, which was back in 2008, there was a large number of people that were without water service due to the loss of electricity after the hurricane. And so when the Texas legislature in 2009 and 2011 created requirements for affected utilities, and you're going to hear that term quite a bit, in Harris and Fort Bend counties to develop an emergency preparedness plan. So Fort Bend County is right next to Harris County. Harris County is where City of Houston is, essentially. And so down there, you know, in East Texas. So what is the EPP? Essentially, it consists of a packet of information that the water system has to submit to TCEQ for review. And the plan contains information about the affected utility and how it operates under emergency conditions. So we had our Hurricane Ike back in 2008, EPP requirements for Harris and Fort Bend County. And so that's been around for about 10 years. So it was essentially a hurricane that kind of initiated this EPP process. But now we have Senate Bill 3 out of the 87th legislature, so that's pretty much this past summer. So Senate Bill 3 became effective in June of 2021. So once the bill became effective, that really wasn't that long ago, you know, a few months ago. And so essentially what it did, it created the Texas Water Code section 13.1394. And if you look at Senate Bill 3, if y'all have looked at it, it's a fairly lengthy document. I want to say it's 50 or 60 pages, and the EPP component is only about 5 pages of that. So there's a lot of other information in there, you know, in Senate Bill 3. But from a TCEQ perspective, a major component was creating the emergency preparedness plan requirements for affected utilities in 252 counties in the state, and that was as a result of the winter storm in February 2021. So as Haley mentioned, there's 254 counties in Texas. So Harris and Fort Bend County already had their requirements. So when we say the other 252 counties, that's essentially the remainder of the state, because there's 2 sets of requirements. There's Harris and Fort Bend County, then the remainder of the state. And again, it was as a result of the winter storm in February 2021, which I refer to as the deep freeze. I know I went without power for about 82 hours, and then there was a couple days where I didn't have water either. So it was a, you know, pretty big impact. Now, the EPP must demonstrate how the affected utility is going to operate at or above 20 PSI during an extended power outage that lasts for more than 24 hours, okay? And so again, 20 PSI during an extended power outage that lasts for more than 24 hours. So if your normal supply of power goes down to your water plants for 24 hours or more, then, you know, you need to start utilizing your EPP, because the key is that you're going to have to continue to provide 20 PSI until normal power is restored. So there is no upper limit on that. I mean, technically you have to provide that 20 PSI for however long that is. Is it going to be 2 days, 3 days? Hopefully it's not super long, but there were folks in around the Houston area after Ike that didn't have water potentially for upwards of around 2 weeks. And so it's kind of a moving target because people say, how long do I have to run my generators for? Well, whatever option you choose, it just has to maintain 20 PSI until your electrical service is fully restored and you no longer have to implement your EPP. So the EPP also has to ensure excuse me, let me start over. You have to ensure the emergency operations as soon as safe and practicable following the occurrence of a natural disaster. So essentially what that's meaning, let's say you have a hurricane, for example, and there's a mandatory evacuation. The expectation for the EPP requirements is not that you have to stay there at the plant. You need to evacuate and then come back when it's safe to return. I was living in Beaumont, working in the TCEQ region office when Hurricane Ike hit. I evacuated to Louisiana and was able to come back the very next day once it was safe to return. And so the expectation, again, is not that you stay there during that disaster, for example, if it is a hurricane, but when it's safe to come back, do an evaluation of your system, figure out if you lost power for more than 24 hours, and if that's the case, implement your EPP. So let's go over some important dates. So if you're considered to be an affected utility, and we'll go over that definition multiple times during this webinar, you have to submit the EPP to TCEQ by March 1st, 2022. So that's this coming March. That's coming up, fairly soon. So the affected utilities must implement their EPP by July 1st, 2022. So let me give you an example. You submit your EPP, TCEQ approves it, and let's say you're in the process of acquiring permanently stalled generators. And so the implementation means that you have those generators installed and they're ready to go by July 1. That is the implementation date. Same would hold true if you've got portable generators. Implementation means that you're ready to go to implement that EPP. So if something happens on July 1st, you're good to go with your EPP to go ahead and maintain that 20 PSI. Now, when I say 20 PSI, that's Senate Bill 3 requirements. I'll compare those with Harrison-Fort Bend County here in a few minutes. So TCEQ is going to have to review and approve the EPPs to determine if the alternative power option selected will provide the system with electrical power necessary to pressurize their system during emergency situations. So TCEQ is going to have to review and ideally approve that EPP. So this webinar is not necessarily intended for affected utilities and EPP requirements for Harris and Fort Bend counties. And the reason being is that some of the requirements are different. So the first difference is the pressure requirements. Remember how we said Senate Bill 3 references you have to maintain at least 20 PSI during that emergency situation. If it's Harris or Fort Bend County, then you have to maintain 35 PSI. And again, those requirements have been around for at least 10 years. Now, the available EPP options are different also. So options 1 through 6 were essentially the same between Harrison-Fort Bend County and Senate Bill 3, the remainder of the state. For Senate Bill 3, though, there was options, I want to say options 7 through 13 or 8 through 13, but we'll get into that. Those are new options that are not available to Harris and Fort Bend County. So again, there's additional options available to meet the EPP requirements under Senate Bill 3 that are not available to Harris and Fort Bend County. So each set of requirements have their own template. Harris and Fort Bend County have their own EPP template. The remainder of the state under Senate Bill 3 has a revised template that is different. There's definitely a lot of similarities. And if you're in Harris and Fort Bend counties, you can still learn from this webinar. I'll just be very clear what the distinctions are when we're going through this so as not to get the two sets of requirements confused. So what is an affected utility? That's who has to meet the EPP requirements, whether you're in Harris, Fort Bend County, or the remainder of the state. But the definitions are a little bit different. So under Senate Bill 3, an affected utility, it created Section 13.1394 in the Texas Water Code, and it's defined an affected utility as a retail public utility, exempt utility, or provider or conveyor of potable or raw water service that furnishes water service to more than one customer and is not an affected utility under Texas Water Code Section 13.1395. So that Texas Water Code Section 13.1395, that's applicable to Harris and Fort Bend County. So it's basically saying you're an affected utility, but you're not in Harris and Fort Bend County. So again, they have two different sets of requirements. And when it says, you know, this could be for potable water or raw water service, and it talks about furnishing water service to more than one customer. Look at a customer in a community setting as a connection. Are you ultimately serving water that's going to end up going to more than one connection? And if the answer is yes, then almost all community systems that I can think of are almost always going to be an affected utility. If you're a non-community system, you might not be. So affected utilities. So if your water system provides water to customers or connections that are either full-time or temporary residents of their water system, of that affected utility, or another water system, basically, more than likely, you're going to be an affected utility. Because it created a little confusion with some of the water wholesalers, because if you wholesale water and you only wholesale it to one PWS, some of those wholesalers thought, well, I only have one customer. But that's not the way TCEQ looks at it, because if that one customer you wholesale to has 10,000 connections, TCEQ is going to look at that like you have 10,000 customers, not one. So that's the way we kind of look at it through the interpretation from the EPP program and the water supply division. So if you're a community system and you're a wholesaler, pretty much you're going to be an affected utility. So let's go over some examples of affected utilities. So again, when I say affected utility, that means that you have to meet Senate Bill 3 in terms of the EPP requirements. Or if you're in Harrison, Fort Bend County and you're an affected utility, you have to meet those applicable requirements. So, excuse me. So public water system that ultimately serves residential customers. I say ultimately because you might be a water wholesaler. And so even if you just have one PWS customer, how many connections are they serving? And it's probably going to be more than one if they're a PWS for sure. So it could be a hospital. And so the key with the hospital is people spend the night, and you'll hear this term overnight accommodations. So a hospital would be considered an affected utility if they were producing their own drinking water. If they were producing their own drinking water. So we got this question the other day. If a hospital in the city of Austin is just a big customer of the city of Austin, well, they're not producing their own drinking water, so they're not considered to be an affected utility. But let's just say it's a big hospital and they have a well and they're producing their own drinking water. They're not purchasing water from another PWS. They're going to be an affected utility. Same with the assisted living home and nursing homes. If they're producing their own drinking water, then they're going to be an affected utility. Again, if they're just customers of another approved PWS, they're probably not going to be an affected utility. They're just viewed as a customer because they're not producing their own water. So prisons and detainment centers overnight, if folks can spend the night there, then that's going to be an affected utility. So hotels, motels, resorts, universities, or boarding schools with dorms, and again, the distinction with dorms is overnight accommodations. Could be marinas with occupied houseboats or 24-hour daycares. Recovery centers, RV parks, and recreational areas with overnight camping access. So a lot of county parks, state parks that offer camping. And so if they're producing their own drinking water and they're not a customer on another PWS, more than likely they're going to be considered an affected utility. So what is not considered to be an affected utility, or in this scenario, non-affected utility? So if your water system is a non-community system without overnight accommodations, you will not be considered an affected utility. Okay, so some examples, if you just have a school without dormitories, no one spends the night there, then you're not an affected utility if you have your own well out back and you're producing your water. And let's say, for the sake of this conversation, all of these meet the definition of a public water system. Daycare centers. Well, usually you drop your kids off, come pick them up, the employees leave, they don't have overnight accommodations, people aren't spending the night there. Restaurants, people don't, spend the night at a restaurant usually. Now, if it's some type of lodge or something, that could kick it over into an affected utility because of the overnight accommodations. But just a restaurant, McDonald's, for example, if they have a well out back, could be a PWS, but they're not going to be considered an affected utility. Another example, industrial plants complexes, not considered an affected utility. Office buildings, banks, and churches. I like the church example, and it says in parentheses without overnight accommodations. But let's say you have a church and they have a summer camp, and they got kids that are spending the night and counselors and whatnot, most of the summer. That could kick it over into the affected utility. But if it's just a church, no camp, no overnight, no summer camp, no overnight accommodations, that would not be considered an affected utility. But again, these are if you're producing your own drinking water. Again, I'm using the example that they got a well out back, and for the sake of these examples, that they meet the definition of a public water system. Now, affected utility is broader than the definition of a public water system, although in those examples, to simplify it, I said they were all PWSs, but it could apply to a system that does not meet the definition of a public water system. Because if you convey potable water or raw water and it's to more than one customer or connection, then you're considered to be an affected utility. So let me give you an example. Let's say I start an RV park and I have a well, and I disinfect the water, but I only have five RV spots. And let's say people are there most of the time. It's booked up well in advance, and people are always staying there at the 5 slots I have. And let's say that those 5 slots, that they do not end up serving 25 people at least 60 days out of the year, and they don't have 15 connections or more. So in that scenario, it would not meet the definition of a public water system, but since you have the overnight accommodations, then you're serving more than one customer, then that would be an affected utility, but not a PWS. But right now, TCEQ is mainly focused on our universe that we know that's out there, which is the public water systems. But I guess through a complaint, TCEQ could find out about it, and someone may not meet the definition of public water system, but could still have to meet the Senate bill requirements, for the EPPs. So if your system provides water to more than one customer, i.e. connection, or have overnight accommodations, you are more than likely an affected utility. And it's also going to apply to raw water providers, because if you go back to the definition of an affected utility, it's conveyor of potable or raw water. So if you're a raw water provider, these requirements are probably going to apply to you also. So let's go over some of the Senate Bill 3 definitions, and a lot of this is verbatim out of the bill. So emergency operations, that's going to mean the operation of a water system during an extended power outage that impacts the operating affected utility. So emergency operations means you lose power. What's an extended power outage though? That means a power outage lasting for more than 24 hours. Extended power outage lasts more than 24 hours from your normal power supply. And so that is when the EPP requirements kick in. So if you have an approved EPP, something happens and you lose power for more than 24 hours, then that's when your EPP requirements are going to kick in. And usually that's going to be a hurricane, could potentially be a deep freeze. Obviously, we've learned from recent experience, wildfires, I guess, but just anything that's an emergency condition that basically you don't have power from your normal power supply, i.e. off the grid, for more than 24 hours. And again, we went over the affected utility definition, I just want to point out where it says provide or convey of potable or raw water service. So it's potable or raw, that would apply. Again, furnish water service to more than one customer. Look at that as a connection, and or if there's overnight accommodations. And again, is not an affected utility under 13.1395, which is the Harris and Fort Bend requirements, or definition, I should say. Emergency operation. An affected utility shall ensure the emergency operation of its water system during an extended power outage at a minimum water pressure of 20 pounds per square inch, or at a water pressure level approved by the commission. And right now, it's my understanding they're sticking with the 20 PSI. And again, as soon as safe and practical following the occurrence of the natural disaster. So again, you're not expected to be there during that emergency situation or natural disaster, but when it's safe to return, go ahead and come back and evaluate where you're at with your system. So an affected utility is going to have to adopt and submit to the commission for its approval an emergency preparedness plan that demonstrates the utility's ability to provide the emergency operation. So again, fill out the appropriate template, send it to TCEQ for review. So if the commission, which is TCEQ, determines that the plan is not acceptable, the commission shall recommend changes to the plan. The commission must make its recommendation on or before the 90th day after the commission receives the plan. Okay, so basically, if you have until March 1st to submit your EPP, and we have 90 days to review it, if you submit it, you know, last day of February, whatever that's going to be this coming, you know, this coming February, think about it. TCEQ has 90 days to review that, and you've got 4 months to implement it. So you may want to get those in a little bit sooner rather than later, because we do have 90 days to review it. And again, the implementation date is going to be July 1st. So March 1st, July 1st, that's 4 months. TCEQ has 3 months or 90 days to review that plan. So now what I want to do is go through the Senate Bill 3 EPP options. And so what that means is they have 14 options here that you can use, that you have to choose in order to comply with the EPP requirements. And so there's certain options. These first options that we're going to go over were also available and still are available to Harris and Fort Bend County. I'll make sure I'll point out which options are not available to Harris and Fort Bend County. But under Senate Bill 3, there was 14 options. So option number 1 is the maintenance of automatically starting auxiliary generators. So automatically starting. So if you want to claim option 1 and you have these big generators at your big groundwater surface water treatment plants, but they don't automatically sense that the power went out and automatically turn on, then you can't claim it under option 1, because that came up in the last webinar we did here on Friday. And if they're manual, you can't claim it under option 1. You might be able to claim it under a different option, but you can't claim it under option 1. Now, option 1 is a very good option, but it's probably one of the more expensive options too. And generators obviously might be a little hard to come by here. I think companies that are selling generators are still weeks upon weeks out from being able to deliver something. So that may make it a little difficult to meet that July 1st implementation date. And I also wanted to state that what's listed in the EPP template for Senate Bill 3, the verbiage is different. It's different in the template. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on these, because we're going to go into a lot of detail in the actual template. So option number 2 is the sharing of auxiliary generator capacity with one or more affected utilities. Third option, the negotiation of leasing and contracting agreements. And what that means is if you can find a company that leases generators and get some sort of an agreement, leasing agreement or contract with them, that in the event of an emergency that you need a generator, that they will provide you one, and you get that documentation in writing. And then you also secure some sort of agreement with a fuel provider, because a lot of the bigger generators are going to be diesel. And so you may have to install, a fuel tank at the plant and then secure that leasing agreement. So a lot of folks think that you have to have generators, permanent generators installed, and that's the only way to meet the EPP requirement. That's not necessarily true. The main thing you have to consider is, how am I going to maintain 20 PSI when I don't have my main electrical supply? All right, so we talked about the leasing and contracting agreements, but also emergency mutual aid agreements with other retail public utilities, essentially other affected utilities or water systems. If the agreement provide for coordination with the Division of Emergency Management in the Governor's Office, Texas Division of Emergency Management, or TDEM, if y'all heard of them before. And one thing, once your EPP does get approved, you have to send a copy of your approved EPP and your letter to the Texas Division of Emergency Management. We'll talk about that later, but I think that kind of covers the coordination with TDEM as it's stated in Senate Bill 3. All right, now we're going to go over options 4 through 7. So the use of portable generators capable of serving multiple facilities, but they have to be equipped with quick connect systems. So again, option number 1, we talk about the permanently installed automatic switchover generators. And then option number 4 is the use of portable generators, but it talks about it has to be equipped with a quick connect system. So essentially you have to have that thing wired up and ready to go so that when you bring the generator over there, you can just plug it in and you're not searching around for an electrician during an emergency situation. So essentially have it wired up and ready to go to accept that portable generator in case an event happens, an emergency situation where you need to use those portable generators. Option number 5, the use of on-site electrical generation is essentially what this bullet is referring to. It's not referring to a generator exactly. What it's referring to more so is you might have solar panels. You could have, a wind farm, for example, wind energy, not very likely. I guess technically you could have hydroelectric, probably not very likely either. But in other words, you have the capability of producing your own electricity and not necessarily through the use of a generator. Okay. Next option is going to be hardening of the electric transmission and electric distribution system against damage from natural disasters during an extended power outage. So for your water system, all of the electrical components and transmission lines that y'all own, that hardening means you either bury them underground and protect them from flooding, or what continues to be above ground that you upgrade so that it can withstand historical hurricane force winds. Probably, a better option if you're down around the coast, but if you're not around the coast, I'm not sure. That sounds like that would be kind of expensive. And, so anyways. Option number 7, for existing facilities, the maintenance of direct engine or right angle drives. And really how I had this described, I had no idea what this was when I first read Senate Bill 3. I had to ask around. It's essentially a small piece of equipment that's similar to a generator, but it only runs one piece of equipment. And so when we went through options 1 through 6, they are standalone options. You can use one of those options and they're standalone. For this one, option number 7, and the options after this, they're not necessarily standalone. We'll go over that in more detail on the template. So 1 through 7 were available to Harrison-Fort Bend County. So those are the same, no matter where you're at. Now, when we start with option 8 through 13, those are new, and those are not available to Harrison-Fort Bend County. And so when we go through 8 through 13, these are not standalone options. You couldn't just pick, for example, water storage capabilities, which is that second bullet, and that be sufficient for your EPP to get approved. So you have to pair these with another option. So it's not that I just choose one option. One option may be enough to get your EPP approved. Other situations, you may be choosing 4 or 5 or 6 options if you're a pretty large complicated system. But again, these options 8 through 13 are not standalone options. So designation of the water system as a critical load facility or redundant, isolated, or dedicated electrical feeds. So critical load facility is basically, you can get that designation by applying for that status with your electric provider. And so critical load facility is like hospitals, police stations, fire stations. When they're doing load shedding, they may not cut off the power to that grid if there's a critical facility there. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get that designation if you apply through your electric company, but it's a good idea, because if you have that critical load status, you may have your power stay on, as opposed to if you didn't, if you're a water provider. So keep that in mind. And then if the power does go out, you could possibly be on a priority list to get that electricity back up and running quicker. And so there were some requirements with the Public Utility Commission, and out of Senate Bill 3, there was a deadline of November 1st that just passed. So every affected utility has to provide some information to the Public Utility Commission on which facilities are critical load status, and you really have to list all your water and wastewater facilities, the best I could tell. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, because that is another state agency. And if I have time towards the end of the webinar, they have a one-page fact sheet. So if we have time, I'll open that up, but I want to make sure we get through all the TCEQ stuff first. So an EPP option, which is not standalone, is you can be designated as a critical load facility by your electric provider. And obviously that you need to apply for it, and hopefully they respond to you in writing if you got it, so you have that documentation. And so if you have a redundant feed, that just basically means like a water plant can get power from 2 different sources. Now, it may or may not be the same provider, but you have kind of a dual feed, so to speak. So that's what they mean by redundant. Essentially, it's a backup electrical supply. Now, if it's with the same electric provider and the electric provider goes down, may not do you a whole lot of good. And so the dedicated electrical feed, as I understand it, and I'm not an electrician or expert on generators or electricity too much, but dedicated electrical feed means you just have your own supply line coming to your plant, and other power users are not coming off that transmission line. It's coming just to your facility. The next option is going to be water storage capabilities. The way I kind of look at that, I guess if you have a ton of elevated storage, but eventually if you have production facilities like a surface water plant or wells, eventually you're going to need electricity to get water in the tanks. It's not going to sustain indefinitely. And that's kind of how TCEQ looked at this, and that wouldn't be me, or small business, but the water supply division and the EPP program. And so again, 8 through 13 are not standalone options. So the next option, water supplies delivered from outside the service area of an affected utility. We'll go into more detail about that. It could be through an emergency interconnect. Maybe it could be you use a TCEQ approved water hauler and you haul water in. But again, you still may need some electricity to get that out to your distribution system, or backup power at least. The ability to provide water through artesian flows, not going to spend a whole lot on this one. Some wells and aquifers in Texas actually flow under pressure. And so you don't actually, I guess, necessarily need to pump it out. Like you normally could have a submersible pump, downhole, or vertical turbine up at the ground service, but water flows up under pressure. And I think you'd still need electricity for your disinfection equipment. If you have like sodium hypochlorite, you're feeding bleach. I mean, any of those pumps are going to need electricity. But that was in the bill, the ability to provide water through artesian flows. I don't think a whole lot of people are going to use that, but it is an option that they could use, which again, you kind of have to pair it with another option. So redundant interconnectivity between pressure zones. So you may have various pressure planes or pressure zones at your system. And so a lot of times those can be separated by a closed valve. And so let's say during an emergency situation, you want to open those valves up and operate it as one pressure plane. Granted, you might have some of your higher elevations that have lower pressure, but if you think you can squeak by with 20 PSI or higher, then that could be an option. And again, that's kind of an option you may have to pair with another one. Let's say I want to, I've got 2 main water plants and I'm going to open up the valves operated as one pressure plant, and I'm only going to use one of my water plants because I've got a generator at that one, and I think that's going to be enough water for my system. I'm just throwing that out there. Each system is going to be different, but that's another option, redundant interconnectivity. All right, emergency water demand rules to maintain emergency operations. I look at that as implementing your drought contingency plan. Maybe you can conserve that water so it lasts a little bit longer. But again, just like the water storage capability option, that's not going to sustain indefinitely, because eventually you're still going to have to get water into your system. And conservation will help, but eventually that's going to run out. And this last option here, any other alternative determined by the commission to be acceptable. So, for example, let's say you got generators and they're permanent, but yet they don't have the automatic switchover. Maybe if your plant is staffed 24/7, 365 days a year, maybe you could propose that under option 14, because if it doesn't have the automatic switchover, you can't claim it under option 1. And so possibly that scenario could maybe even go under option 5 in the use of on-site electrical generation, because you can't claim it under 1, which is the permanent generator. But so sometimes you might look at the other options, and you can always reach out to us. I actually had to contact the EPP program on that one, and they seemed like that would be reasonable because it was staffed 24/7. Okay, so those are the 14 options. And again, 1 through 6 are what I refer to as standalone. If you just pick one of those options, that's standalone. Once you get into option 7, which is the last bullet there, 7 through 13 may not be standalone, may not. And we'll get into that in more detail. And so again, on surface water, on Senate Bill 3, raw surface water. So each affected utility that supplies, provides, or conveys raw surface water shall include in its emergency preparedness plan provisions for demonstrating the capability of each raw water intake pump station, each pump station, and pressure facility to provide raw water service to its wholesale customers during emergencies. So if you're a raw water provider and you wholesale that water to like a city that has a surface water treatment plant, and they rely on you, and they rely on you for that water, you still have to have an EPP and be able to provide that raw water to your wholesale customer, the city in this example, if there's an extended power outage. So essentially, you still have to figure out a way to get that water to your wholesale customer. Now, this subsection does not apply to raw water services that are unnecessary or otherwise subject to interruption or curtailment during emergencies under a contract. So you might have a contract for raw water service from a river authority, for example. You have a contract with them, there's an emergency situation, and this is kind of a water rights type deal. That's what TCEQ, we issue water rights permits to use waters of the state, surface waters of the state, that is. And so let's say you have a surface water plant, you don't have a water rights permit with TCEQ, so you buy your water from a river authority and you have a contract with them. Essentially what that's saying is if that river authority interrupts you, which means you can no longer take water, or curtails you, which means they ask you to take less, and it's during an emergency situation and you have a contract with them, then what it's saying is you, as that raw water supplier, are not obligated to provide that water to your wholesale customer in that scenario only. So that last sentence is just saying, if this occurs in the last sentence, then you don't have to meet the first sentence, is what that means. So if you get in the weeds on this, or this somehow seems to apply to your system, contact us or the EPP program, and we'll be happy to discuss that situation with you. So there is one scenario where a raw water provider would not have to provide water to its wholesale customers, and that's the caveat. So what does TCEQ have to do? TCEQ is going to have to adopt rules to implement this section as an alternative to any rule requiring elevated storage. And I think this was also applicable in Harrison-Fort Bend County, but once you get over 2,500 connections, the preferred method of pressure maintenance is elevated storage, not pressure tanks. So 2,500 connections is essentially the cutoff. So they want you to have elevated storage once you get higher than that. So let's say there's a system that has 4,000 connections. Well, preferred method is elevated storage. But what they're saying is if you have an approved EPP, they may allow you to go up beyond the 2,500 connections and still be on pressure tanks or hydropneumatic tanks. And so keep that in mind. If you have an approved EPP, you may be able to go over the 2,500 connections and not have to have elevated and still use pressure tanks for pressure maintenance. So the commission is going to have to provide an affected utility with access to the TCEQ's financial, managerial, and technical contractors to assist the utility in complying with the applicable emergency preparedness plan submission deadline. Okay, submission deadline is March 1st. TCEQ, and this is through the Water Supply Division, which is also where the EPP program is, they have a contract with the Texas Rural Water Association, and it's basically these contractors are essentially water and wastewater operators, licensed water and wastewater operators, some folks that have previously worked at TCEQ, and really it covers water and wastewater. So any sort of compliance related issue with water or wastewater that you're having that TCEQ regulates, they can do on-site technical assistance, and it's free to the utility. So it's a water system or wastewater, it's a free service. Now, before the pandemic, almost all of it was provided on-site. So for example, if you needed help filling out an EPP, I'm not saying during the pandemic they're going to come out and visit you, but I think there's a good chance, but it's going to be a case-by-case situation. So let's say there was no pandemic, they could come out and help you complete your EPP on site. And so that could take, better half of a day, if not longer, to get that form filled out because it's a pretty long template. But so there is different types of assistance that y'all can receive. You can contact Haley and I, and we'll give you those resources later on, but you can use our financial, managerial, and technical contractors to help you complete the EPP form if you're looking at it and you're just going, man, I'm just not getting this. I need some help. We can definitely do that. So I get questions about, hey, what are the regulations on generators? There's not a whole lot. The main one is an emergency generator used as part of an approved EPP must be operated and maintained according to the manufacturer's specifications. Kind of common sense. And so that's straight out of Senate Bill 3. So the commission shall inspect each utility to ensure that the utility complies with the approved plan. So what that means is when you get investigated or inspected by the TCEQ region office, like you normally do, for community systems, it's usually once every 3 years. For non-communities, it's once every 5 years. They're going to take a look at your EPP plan and make sure that you're complying with that approved plan. So keep that in mind. That's an additional thing that they're going to look at when they come out there. And they haven't quite developed that process yet, so it could change, but I'm assuming they're going to do it during their normal comprehensive compliance investigations or your site visits that you get per frequency. So the commission shall consider whether compliance with this section will cause a significant financial burden on customers of an affected utility. So TCEQ actually has a regulatory guidance that we'll talk about and that outlines what all needs to be submitted. But if you're a distribution only system, you purchase water under direct pressure, all you have is a distribution system. You don't have wells, you don't have a surface water plant, you don't have ground storage tanks, you don't have pumps, you don't have elevateds, you don't have anything. You're distribution only. In an ideal situation, and we'll get into this, your provider that sells you that water under direct pressure would say, yes, we'll cover this system here, the direct pressure system, and we'll cover them in our EPP. If they're willing to do that, you're good to go. If they're not willing to do that, which is their option, unfortunately, TCEQ can't force them to cover you in their EPP, unfortunately. But So then you could submit the, the financial waiver, essentially. And so basically, we'll figure out how much money you charge all your customers and kind of come up with an average water bill per year. Then you figure out how much would it cost me to comply with the EPP requirements. Well, I'm going to have to drill a well now. I'm going to have to install a storage tank. I'm going to have to get disinfection. I'm going to have to, install at least 2 service pumps, a pressure tank, an air compressor, and then I'm going to have to buy a permanent generator. So you cost all that out. And then the Water Supply Division or the EPP program will determine whether or not that's a financial burden to the customer. So whatever they're billed for water and what the average cost per customer connection for not only water service, but the cost of implementing the EPP. So we ask for information so it kind of can be broken down to include those 2 components, average water bill, cost of implementing the EPP, and then they'll do an evaluation on that. But we're going to go into a lot of detail on that here shortly. So out of Senate Bill 3, an affected utility may adopt and enforce limitations on water use while the utility is providing emergency operations. So you can implement your drought contingency plan and restrict outside watering, whatever it is that you can implement. So that's out of Senate Bill 3. And so essentially that last bullet, the EPPs are going to be treated as confidential information by TCEQ. And so what that means is if we treat it as confidential, that means that someone cannot come in and do an open records request and get a copy of that EPP. TCEQ will treat that as confidential information. So in terms of compliance with the EPP requirements, first of all, and I kind of maybe got these out of order a little bit, but off of the template, Harrison, Fort Bend County have their own template. The rest of the state has a different template. Choose the appropriate option or options. Complete the appropriate template in its entirety, everything that's applicable, and submit it to the TCEQ Water Supply Division, which houses the EPP program, for review and approval. Now, if you think you might be eligible for a financial waiver, you can submit the information for the financial waiver. If that financial waiver gets approved, that means you do not have to submit and get an EPP approved. We've determined that it's going to cost you too much money, so you get a waiver from the EPP requirement. So you either get an approved EPP or an approved waiver. One of the 2 you have to have. So for example, if the deadline is March 1st, for submission of the EPP to TCEQ, then don't wait till February to submit a waiver, because if your waiver gets denied, you're still going to have to submit an EPP. So keep that in mind. So the financial waiver, it's a TCEQ regulatory guidance document, and it's regulatory guidance RG 553, and it's entitled Emergency Preparedness Plan Drinking Water Financial Waiver. So the TCEQ may grant a waiver to the requirements to submit an EPP if it is determined that the implementation of an EPP causes a significant financial burden on the utility's customers. This financial waiver information is also applicable to affected utilities in Fort Bend and Harris County. So RG 553, anyone in the state can use that. We have 2 separate templates for the EPP, but the RG 553, anyone can use that. It's applicable to Harrison, Fort Bend counties also. So let's talk about the affected utility and the financial waiver. And so we have that regulatory guidance document that I just talked about, and it's only 4 pages long. So they have 2 scenarios there, one for billing customers and one for non-billing of customers. So some non-community systems don't send out a water bill. Since most of the folks here, I'm assuming, are with community water systems, the information I pulled out of that RG is going to be for utilities that bill for their water service. So if you want the waiver, you're going to have to provide documents demonstrating how much customers are charged for water annually. Then submit all necessary price quotes needed to provide emergency operations. So those are the 2 things that we talked about. How much are you charging your customers for water on an annual basis? And what's the annual cost to each customer per year for the implementation of the EPP? You kind of add those 2 up, and, or at least TCEQ will, and that's what they kind of use to make that evaluation. So we'll get into the weeds a little bit on this. So the average monthly water usage per connection is what you're going to have to provide. So you can do this in the form of a spreadsheet, probably the best way, but it needs to contain 12 months of continuous data. So it needs to have one column containing the total amount of water sold from the system each month, January, February, March, so on and so forth. So again, one column containing the total amount of water sold from the system each month, one value for each month. And then another column containing how many connections are billed for water each month. Hopefully y'all know how many are being billed each month. And you're going to have to provide the initial base rate, your base water rate, and the additional water rate after the base amounts are surpassed. A pretty simple example, $16 is your base rate, which includes 1,000 gallons of water, and then $1.25 for every 1,000 gallons thereafter. And you probably have a tiered structure where the more water you use, the more you charge them. But this could be your tariff for just, what you're charging your customers, what that rate structure is essentially. So this information, it can be provided in a statement from the system owner or in a copy of any document given to the customer showing how customers are charged for water. Like a lot of water supply corporations, cities, they probably have their rate structure on their website. So we're just looking for what you're charging your customer. But any other customer charges used to subsidize the water system, you can include that also. So for example, if you have taxes or surcharges or other fees, this information can be provided in a statement similar to what I described in the bullet before. So basically, what is your cost of running that water system? All of those costs can be included in there to determine basically what you're charging your customers. All right, so we'll talk about cost estimates or quotes for providing the emergency operations. So you're going to need to provide documentation estimating the total cost of implementing an EPP. So we're going to go over a list, and it may not capture all costs, but it will kind of, get you thinking in the right direction. So all the costs associated with implementing an EPP must be documented through any of the following. So you can use engineering quotes, manufacturers quotes, or current published price information gathered from the internet. So some of the potential expenses may include, obviously, your generator, but you just have to make sure it's capable of operating plant equipment necessary to provide potable water to your customers lasting more than 24 hours. In other words, make sure you size it correctly for the kilowatts that's going to be needed at your plant, or megawatts, I guess, for that matter, if it's a big one. So this may include equipment such as a well, treatment units, air compressor for pressure tanks, and service pumps. So it could be, I've got to put in a well, treatment, air compressor, pressure tanks. I kind of alluded to that earlier. And then I've also got to buy a generator potentially. So in terms of installation of the generators, go ahead and include, both the concrete slab or the pad for the generator, including any of the leveling material and structural housing for the generator. If you install protective fencing around the generator to keep out intruders, you can include the fencing, the razor wire, the alarm system, security company, security lights, things like that. Anything associated with that installation of that generator. You may need to install secondary spill containment berm to capture accidental oil and fluid spillage from the generators. Or if you have, diesel tanks, auxiliary tank, fuel tanks for the generator, include sufficient fuel to operate for 72 hours is the recommendation from the EPP program. So any of the site work, if you had to remove trees, installation of a gas line, if you want to go with the propane generator, include all of that. Any of the electrical work, it could be installation of automatic transfer switch, which remember that's required for the permanent generators to be able to claim under option 1. Electric service panels, upgrading to 3-phase electricity, include all of that. So construction and other costs. So Construction or other types of permits can include annual maintenance fee. Some water systems will need the installer operator to service the generator annually, or the warranty will be voided. So you can include those costs if they'll contract that out. You might have incur insurance fees. You can include that too. And of course, the design and construction of a well, water tank, and pumps for systems without a water plant. So if you're direct pressure only, you know, what's it going to cost me to put a plane in, and then what is it going to cost me to do everything else for the generator? Okay. So financial costs, give a description of how you plan to finance the costs associated with designing and implementing an EPP. So for example, maybe you're securing a loan, you know, a 10-year loan and increasing rate over a 2-year period, things like that. Maybe you have to go to the Texas Water Development Board and get a low interest loan, just whatever that is. What's the total amount and what's the term of that loan? That's really what they're trying to figure out, because then they can break that down. Okay, this is going to cost X amount of dollars per year. You have X number of customers. Let's divide that 1 year loan total cost by the number of customers, so we can figure out how much is each customer going to have to pay for this. And not only that, so it could come back and, wow, this is going to cost each customer $100 for the next 15 years, $100 a month for the next 15 years, and their average water bill is $50. So if their water bill goes up to $150 a month, what is that per year? And so that could potentially be a good scenario for getting a financial waiver approved. So I'm just trying to get you all to think in very basic terms, kind of what TCEQ is wanting to see with this, but we're really just trying to have you all submit the documentation. What are you charging your customers? How much is implementation of the EPP going to cost when everything's considered? Okay, and where are you getting your financing from? How long's the loan? Things of that nature. And then they'll kind of just crunch those numbers and see what that impact is per customer per year. Some of the other resources that are available, the Texas Water Infrastructure Coordination Committee, or TWIC. It's kind of a one-stop shopping for funding agencies, and I'll hit that one in a little more detail on my next slide. We talked about the Financial, Managerial, and Technical Assistance, or FMT. Talked about that. The Texas Water Wastewater Agency Response Network, or TexMOR. I'm sure there's folks that are on this webinar that are actually members of this. And so their mission statement is to support and promote statewide emergency preparedness, disaster response, and mutual aid assistance for public and private water and wastewater utilities. And hopefully we have enough time to go to their website, because there's several interesting options that TexMOR can kind of help out with in certain ways. So when we talked about TWIC, it's really one-stop shopping. And TCEQ and the EPA are part of TWIC, but more importantly, it has the funding providers, whether they're state or federal. So like Texas Water Development Board, the Texas Department of Agriculture, the United States Department of Agriculture. That's just a few examples of some of the participating members. And so you can fill out a funding inquiry form, and it could be like, hey, I need 3, 500 kilowatt generators to meet the EPP requirements. And you fill out, I think it's a 2-page form. And the nice thing about it is, instead of having to go to each of the agencies and see what programs they have that might help you for whatever your funding is. It could be drilling a new well, new surface water plant, replacing distribution lines. I'm just using the generators as an example. And so what it'll do, it'll go out to the TWIC members and they'll review it, and then they'll provide a response back, and they'll consolidate that into one letter so that each agency or organization will tell you what either low interest loans or loan forgiveness or grants that they may have available for you. So again, so that you don't have to go around to all the agencies, you kind of take care of it all in one form and you get one response back. So there's their website there, www.twic.org. And there's technical assistance providers like Texas Rural Water Association, Communities Unlimited are also part of TWIC, but good way to try and see what's out there for funding. So if y'all are interested in the financial, managerial, and technical assistance for whatever reason for water and wastewater, and certainly if y'all need assistance completing your EPP template and the form, there's their phone number, and that's the main line of the water supply division. A lot of folks are teleworking, but you can try calling them at 512-239-4691, or probably a better way is through email at fmt@tceq.texas.gov. Or as Haley talked about, we have our small business group, which Haley and I are a part of, have a 1-800 number. So if they need help with FMT, they can use any of these avenues to try and get that needed assistance. All right, so that concludes my PowerPoint presentation. So what we're going to do, we're about to take a 10-minute break here shortly, but we're going to go through probably the TWIC website and show you all their funding form, and they have some funding information there. Probably go to the TextWarn website too, then go through the TCEQ EPP homepage just so y'all can see where all the templates are, and Senate Bill 3 if you care to read through that. But then at the end, and I'd like to go over the Public Utility Commission fact sheet also for that critical load for that November 1 deadline that just passed, and then essentially spend a good chunk of time going through the actual EPP template, because the one that's the revised one for Senate Bill 3 is about 41 pages long. So it takes a while to kind of go through that. So do we have any questions, Stephanie or Haley?
We have one question in the chat, if you wouldn't mind answering it.
Okay.
So it asks, can a PWS directly pass EPP costs to customers?
Well, that's kind of tricky, because we don't regulate utilities. The Public Utility Commission does. And so their rules I've learned a little bit about through the years, but it really just kind of depends on what type of utility you are. If you're an investor-owned utility, you're privately owned, then they have direct jurisdiction over any amount that you charge a customer. So you would have to get approval for any nickel over what you're charging now to charge your customers. Different types of, like, water supply corporations, if 10% of the customers complain, then the PUC may get involved with the rate increase. I don't want to get too far in the weeds there, because I might say something that may not be accurate, but that would really be for the Public Utility Commission to determine, if that makes sense. But in certain scenarios, you would be able to. In certain other scenarios, you may have to get PUC's approval and go through their rate process to get that increase. But I think it's possible.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Were you wanting to go ahead and go through that webpage, or do you want to take the break now?
No, this is a good time to take the 10-minute break.
Okay, with that being said, it is 2:13, so we'll come back at 2:23. Y'all enjoy your break.
Okay, this is Alex. We'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to list a reminder that if we had some folks that joined just a little bit after we started, if you click on the question mark icon and bring up the Q&A, and the very first thing that was published in there, I'm pulling it up right now, it's going to be, let me see, it's the attendance form. So that's the very first thing that's in the Q&A. So you'll have to scroll up to the top there. But in order to get your CEU credit, it's for a water license, you can get up to 4 hours. Now we know people registered, but here, once you're in here, you have to click on that attendance link and you have to complete that. And towards the end, we're also going to post a link to a quiz. So in order to get the CEU credit, you have to complete that attendance form. Then you also have to complete that quiz. So we need those 2 bits of information in order to submit you for getting the up to 4 hours of CEUs. And Stephanie, do you have any other reminders we need to go over real quick?
No, I don't believe so. I'm going to post the Utilifex PUC jurisdiction webpage. Jason had sent it to me, so I'm about to post that in the Q&A for anyone that wants to look over it, and hopefully it could answer the question that we asked before the break.
Okay, is that the fact sheet on the critical load? Do you know?
I'm not quite sure. Haley, do you know what this sheet entails?
Yeah, it's not the same fact sheet, Alex. It's actually a fact sheet for the jurisdiction of, yes, exactly. She's going to share it.
I know what you're talking about now. Okay, awesome, thanks. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started, so bear with me here. So what I wanted to do now is we get a lot of questions about funding for generators, and there's not any specific funding just for this new requirement because that is a state requirement. But what I want to do is go to the TCEQ website. We talked about them as a lot of the funding organizations are a member of that, and that form that you could fill out to see what programs are available that might help fund whatever water or wastewater project you're embarking on. But, for the sake of this, we'll kind of, talk about generators. But so this is TCEQ, and it's TCEQ.org, so TWICC. And so this is their homepage. And let me know how this looks, Stephanie. I know last webinar, I think my internet was a little laggy, so let me know if you can see the TCEQ homepage.
I can, and I can see you scrolling, so we're doing better than last time.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down and let me kind of funding inquiry form. So it's a TCEQ funding inquiry form. So if you're thinking about getting information from different agencies and you want to use this TCEQ form because you're embarking on a water or wastewater project, let's say for the sake of this webinar, you're looking for funding for generators. So you can click on it. It's a Word document. Then it downloads and you just click on it and it opens. All right. So again, this is the TCEQ funding inquiry form. And so it's just going to ask you some basic information about your system, your entity, whether you're water or wastewater, contact information here. And if you're drinking water, you can click here, little box there. List your PWS ID number. And if it's wastewater, go ahead and list your water quality permit number. And obviously if it's both, click both. So they're going to want to know for improvement type, is this for a new facility or are you upgrading existing facilities? List what type of entity you are. And so it's going to kind of want to know what your estimated project costs are for planning, design, construction, and then tally those up under total. And then down here, it's just going to want you to give a brief description of the project. And so just give a description and make sure you read kind of the header there on the information that they're looking for. But again, just describe your project. And again, this is a Microsoft Word document. And so obviously a lot of these agencies do loans, like the Water Development Board does low interest loans, for example. And they're going to want your water rate information. And so that's kind of connections, proposed rate, and kind of your rate structure, essentially. And then they're going to ask for the same thing, basically on wastewater. They're going to ask you some annual operating costs for both water and wastewater, depending on which project you're applying for. And so it's got some questions there. For example, number 1, does this project include acquisition of easements or real property? Just yes or no. And we're just going to want to know what the status of the project planning and design. Has an environmental determination been issued? That was question number 3. Do you have a planning loan? Maybe you've already got loan from another entity for the planning component of it. Maybe you're just looking for, design and construction money for that. And they're going to want to know what some of the balances are on the planning loan And, you know, does this project resolve a compliance issue? And that means, in other words, if you've been written up by TCEQ or received violations and you're trying to, you know, seek funding to get that corrected, to resolve those violations and upgrade your infrastructure. And does your project benefit more than your system? Maybe you wholesale and it's going to benefit your wholesaler too. And so basically just, that's it, staff use here. So pretty straightforward, 2 pages. And, you know, once you submit that, again, it'll go out to the various TWIC members and you'll get one response back with all the various programs that they have, which kind of leads me into my next point here. Not going to save that. So when we're on I'm back on the TWIC homepage here. And so what they have that's pretty neat is called a funding resources guide. So this kind of has all the funding information of the TWIC members. So for example, we talked about the Texas Water Development Board. And so they have kind of information on the program, the funding source there. Let me increase that. Might cut it off a little bit, but you know, whether it's, you know, federal or state funding, you know, eligible applicants, you know, again, because we've got political subdivisions, you got private entities, you got water supply corporations, you know, there's just different, a lot of types of different utilities and water systems. So what's the purpose of the grant, you know, and access and eligibility, terms and interest rates, and then they list, you know, contact information here in that last column. So for example, Texas Water Development Board, Clean Water State Revolving Fund is that first one. And if you go down, Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, that's probably the one I'm most familiar with. That's a lot of money that they have there. So anyways, it just lets you know all the programs they have. Economically Distressed Area Program, State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, of the SWIFT Fund. I think that might have been created out of the Rainy Day Fund after the drought, but I could be wrong. But anyways, Rural Assistance Fund. So Water Development Board has quite a few different types of programs. Still going on the Water Development Board. So let's go down USDA. So that's the United States Department of Agriculture right here. That's rural developments. They have a, you know, USDA Rural Development Fund. They have a Colonia Fund. Let's see, I'm kind of familiar with this one, the Emergency Community Water Assistance Grant, ECWAC. And so I think we've gotten some feedback from an engineer that USDA is evaluating right now, I think maybe for this program, whether or not they can help fund generators or not. Then they have the Community Development Fund, which is actually, I'm sorry, that's under the Texas Department of Agriculture. The Community Development Fund, Colonias, more Colonias, let's see, Planning and Capacity Building Fund, Disaster Relief Urgent Needs. I remember that one from drought also. And so again, NAD Bank has a lending program. So anyways, it just kind of gives you a breakdown of the different entities and what they have to offer. This one right here, National Rural Water Association. It's the State Health Department here. We got TCEQ. But anyways, so just wanted to kind of point that out. So with that said, I think we are done with TWIC. So I think what I would like to do now is go through the TCEQ EPP homepage. So I'm just going to go to Google, put in TCEQ. Let me close this up. So right now I'm just on the TCEQ homepage. And Stephanie, is it still going okay? It's not lagging or anything?
Nope, sounds crystal clear and it's moving right along.
Okay. Okay, so I went to the search box up here and I just put in EPP, like Emergency Preparedness Plan. Just put in the acronym, Emergency Preparedness Plan. Homepage right here. So it's the first thing that pops up. So I'd recommend going and reviewing this if you haven't already. And so if you look over here, it's got to the right under questions or comments, It's got the PDW EPP at tceq.texas.gov. So that is the program area for the EPP program. And so Haley and I actually have access to the shared email box, and we help answer some of the easy to moderate questions. A lot of the policy type related questions we defer to the program area for that, and they've been real helpful with working for us. But this email is all over the place on this web page. But questions or comments, there's the EPP shared email box. Now, a lot of this stuff we already went over, but emergency preparedness plan homepage, here we go. What is the enabling legislation? You have Senate Bill 3 right here. So I'm going to click on Senate Bill 3. So it's actually a link to the bill itself. I'm going to make sure y'all can kind of see it. But again, this is a 51-page document. So the EPP information doesn't start until about page 40. Bear with me. So if you just want to focus on the EPP stuff, you can go down to page 40. Here we go, section 13.1394. Remember I told y'all that was the new part of the Texas Water Code, and it's standards of emergency operations right here. So this is where the EPP stuff starts, and it goes down about 5 pages. So we covered a lot of this information already. Right now it's just going into definitions, but here's where the actual options start. The bottom of page 41. See number 1, the maintenance of automatically starting auxiliary generators. So those are your permanently installed generators. Again, I need to point out automatically starting. So it can't be a manual generator for a permanent one if you're going to claim it under option 1. Now, portable generators under option 4, they don't have to be automatically starting because you don't have them there all the time anyways. They're not going to be hooked up. So it's only for those permanently installed generators that they need to automatically start once the power supply, basically, you no longer have your normal power supply. So anyways, again, remember we talked about Senate Bill 3, there was 14 options. And so really that's about it. If y'all care to go back and read it, it starts on page 40 and it's only about 5 pages long. Okay. Let's see. Maybe I can get this. Okay, so here's where the EPP template is. Now, this form 20536B, this is the new revised template. And so we're going to go over this in a significant amount of detail, but I just wanted to point something out. It says for all affected utilities except Fort Bend and Harris counties. So they have, Harris and Fort Bend County have their own template, and I'll show you where that is here shortly. All right, so again, got the EPP template here. There's an EPP help form. And so this is what Small Business and Local Government Assistance section created. So if you click on that link, it's going to bring you to an online form. So if you need help with SB3, Senate Bill 3 that is, or emergency preparedness plans, you can go ahead and fill this form out. And I do a lot of the phone calls and reaching out to these systems when they submit the form, but we have a group of people that can help out. Could be myself, could be Haley, could be some other folks that work in small business, but a lot of this is self-explanatory. Put in your first name, last name, phone number and email address, and PWS ID number. It says if applicable, because again, this could apply to someone that does not meet the definition of a PWS. But if you're a PWS, go ahead and provide your PWS ID number. What county are you in? That's very important because we need to know if you're in Harris and Fort Bend counties or if you're in some other county, because again, they have 2 sets of requirements. So what do you need help with? We came up with what we thought were the 5 most common questions. Excuse me. So the first one is questions about the EPP template, or it could be understanding requirements of a specific option of the EPP. Let's say you're confused on option number 5. Well, fill out the form and we'll contact you and get that clarified for you. Maybe it's just completing my EPP. Maybe you coming up with lots of questions in different sections on the EPP and you want to get some clarification. Sure, send it on in. Maybe applying for a waiver to the EPP, you want to get more information on, so we can certainly help you with that. And then that last one there is understanding the applicability of EPP requirements to my water system. It could be, hey, I'm not sure if I'm an affected utility or not. I got this letter from TCEQ, or maybe I didn't get the EPP letter from TCEQ. And I just need to talk to someone to kind of clarify whether these requirements apply to me, which means essentially, are you an affected utility or are you not? And then if that didn't answer any of your questions, you can just, type it out here. And when you do that, Haley and I see this, and this is a good way to get, any type of assistance that you need. All right, so I'm going to close that out. And the FMT, it's that there, if you need assistance filling out your EPP, you can fill out the help form if they're simple questions. But if you think, hey, I really need to have someone here on site, spend most of the day going over this to try and get this thing completed, maybe FMT is a better route. And so there's their email address, fmt@tceq.texas.gov. And so if you want to see the homepage for FMT, the TCEQ homepage, then you can click on that and go to their webpage. So it's got a web link there. So we went over why it's required, who is affected. They give some examples. These are pretty much the same ones that I used in my presentation. Talks about how to get your EPP approved. We covered that. Again, important deadlines. You can't hear that enough. Submit the EPP by March 1st. Implement the EPP by July 1st, excuse me. And this is important. Can I ask for an extension to submit or to implement my EPP? Yes. You can. An affected utility may request a 90-day extension. Whoops. Sorry. I was trying to. Yes, an affected utility may request a 90-day extension to either submit or implement their EPP for good cause. So that's important. You cannot request an extension to each of these. So you don't get 2 extension requests. You get 1 extension request, and you have to choose, do I need an extension on the March 1st date, or do I need an extension on the July 1st date for the implementation? You have to choose one of those. And so if you're going to request it, send a letter or email explaining why you need the extension too. And there's the PDW EPP email box. And so you'll see this email on this homepage numerous times. So can the requirements to submit an EPP be waived? Yes, we talked about the financial burden. And the regulatory guidance that we talked about, 553 for the financial burden, there's a link to that document. So this is it right here. And it's 4 pages long. And so we covered a good chunk of this information already, but here's the actual document. And again, it's linked on the TCEQ webpage. It's just that RG 553. Now, here's where the stuff is for Harris and Fort Bend counties. Enabling legislation. So let's look at their template real quick. And bear with me here. So this template looks a little bit different. The confidential part's bigger. It's kind of a reddish color. And it just says Emergency Preparedness Plan Template for affected utilities. But really, this is the one that's only for Harris and Fort Bend counties. And so there's going to be difference. They're going to reference 35 PSI on this form, like right here. Senate Bill 3 is 20 PSI. So again, that's one of the major differences in why there's different templates. And so if we go to Section 3, where it talks about the various options for compliance, notice that they only have 8 options. They only have 8 options. So again, Harrison, Fort Bend County don't have those additional options available to them. The last common option is option 7, use and maintenance of direct engine or right angle drives. And then of course, this last option, option 8, if you want to propose something else, you can. That's option 14 for the Senate Bill 3 new requirement in the other template. So anyways, there are some similarities, but there's definitely distinct differences. So make sure that you're using the correct template. All right. So what I want to do now is I'm going to close this out, and y'all bear with me because I have an EPP example, and this is going to be the new template. So it's not the same template that Harris and Fort Bend counties would use. So just need to caveat that. Let me get this thing blown up a little bit and get it. I want to certainly make sure it's not too small that y'all can't see. But okay, so here we go. So we're going to go through this template. Unfortunately, it's pretty long. It's about 41 pages long, if I'm not mistaken. And it's so long because there's so many different options. And so first of all, make sure you have the right template. Remember, the new template says for all affected utilities except Fort Bend and Harris counties. Okay, so these are all the systems that fall under Senate Bill 3. And so what I recommend, because this can be a little overwhelming, you can try and read it from page 1 to page 41. But the first thing you really need to figure out before you even start trying to get into the weeds of filling out the form is go to section 3. So I'm going to go to section 3 first. So y'all just bear with me here. Okay, so this is section 3. On the blank template, I want to say it starts on about page 10 or so. But go through and read all the options first. Remember, it actually has more than 14 options because they broke out some of the options with the 2A and a 2B. So an A and a B on some of these. So again, the language that's in Senate Bill 3, this is going to be different. You have what's in the bill that got in the Texas Water Code, which is a statute, and then TCEQ kind of had to, read through between the lines a little bit and provide some clarification and actually broke it up into different options. So the language you see here within the template is going to be different than what you see in Senate Bill 3. I would focus on the language in the template as opposed to what's in Senate Bill 3. It's good to know what's in Senate Bill 3 so you have an idea where this stuff came from. But we'll kind of go through this. So option 1, we talked about that, permanently installed automatic starting auxiliary generators. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Good option to have, but an expensive options. Again, generators may be a little hard to find right now. Right. Okay, and so option number 2A. Once you hit option 2, it's broken out into an A and a B. And so option 2A, your system will rely on your provider during an extended power outage. And so this is what a lot of the direct pressure systems or distribution system only will use is option 2A, because essentially you have no facilities. You can't even hook up a generator. You don't have anything that even uses electricity. And so hopefully later on in the template, I'll show you where whoever is your provider can cover you under their EPP, which they're basically stating, yes, we will provide you with 20 PSI to your customer's tap in the event of a power outage lasting longer than 24 hours, which is the emergency situation or condition. Okay, so if you're direct pressure, hopefully you can get them to rely on you. Now, if they say, nope, we can't promise you or guarantee that you're going to get 20 PSI during an emergency, which very well could happen. They may not want to put that in writing and actually cover you. So then that's when you can go the financial waiver route. Okay. And so if you're going to have to install a plant and, generators, that's probably going to be pretty darn expensive. And so you can go the financial waiver route, but I'll show y'all how to fill out the information appropriately if you're a direct pressure system. Now, option 2B, you can become what's referred to as a contributing member of TexWarn. And so TexWarn is a resource sharing organization for water and wastewater. So when I say contributing member, you got to offer up a resource. It could be an operator, an electrician, a backhoe, a dump truck. You got to offer something up. And so the whole theory behind becoming a member of TexWarn and why that's acceptable as a standalone option is, in theory, I'm a member, I have an emergency situation, I've lost power, and it's been longer than 24 hours, and you can request resources. So you go on TexWarn, fill out a request for, let's say you need a 100 kilowatt generator. You do that request through TexWarn, it goes out to all their members, and someone might say, okay, I've got a 200 kilowatt generator and I can have it there for you tomorrow. And ideally, you get that generator installed, you get your alternate power working, generators working fine, you're able to maintain that 20 PSI under Senate Bill 3, 35 PSI for Harrison-Fort Bend County. That's ideally why they allowed that. So you ask for it, hopefully you get it. But the problem with this is just because you request a resource from TexWarn doesn't mean that you're going to get it. So it's definitely not a guarantee, but we will go over the TexWarn website. But you can be a contributing member of TexWarn with the idea that you can get the resources that you need to maintain 20 PSI, which is essentially going to be a generator if you don't have one. So option 3A, negotiation of leasing and contracting agreements. So your facility has obtained a leasing or contract agreement for emergency power and emergency power equipment and fuel. Okay, so again, you don't actually have to have the permanently installed generator or even a portable generator, but if you have a leasing agreement for whatever you need in terms of generator or generators and fuel, so that's two agreements, one for the generator company, one for the fuel company, that is an option that would be acceptable. That could be a little risky too, because if this entity has 100 generators but has 300 agreements, then there might not be a guarantee either. So option 2B and 3A, while they're still good, and 3B for that matter, are really no guarantees. And so option 3B, mutual aid agreements with other water providers. So you can enter into a mutual aid agreement and they say, yeah, when you have an emergency situation, we'll loan you that 200 kilowatt generator that you need. Okay, great. Y'all sign an official agreement, and any option that you choose, you're going to have to go to a different section and provide documentation. So this section 3, this is informative only. There's not anything you have to do. All it's really doing is just describing the options to you. So again, a mutual aid agreement with other water providers, you can do that too. Whatever resource you're going to need to maintain that 20 or 35 PSI, that's a standalone option. So for example, you could just become a contributing member of TexWarn, and that would be a standalone option. Option number 4, use portable generators capable of serving multiple facilities equipped with quick connect systems. So let's say you're a small system, you're not, super big, that is, and you just got a couple small groundwater plants, and you think, heck, if I just have, one portable generator, that should be good enough for me to go to one plant, power everything I need power, get the pressure up in the distribution system, and then head over to that other plant, do the same thing there, and keep doing that. Or however you can do that, but you are allowed to use the portable generators. It doesn't have to be permanently installed, but again, it's got to be equipped with the quick connect system. So it has to be wired wired up so that basically your plant has to be wired up so you could just hook that thing up in an emergency when you need to use it. Option 5, we talked about that, use of on-site electrical generation. Mainly that's going to be solar, wind, or hydroelectric. Hardening of the, option 6, hardening of the electric transmission and distribution system. We already talked about that. You either bury it and protect it from flooding, or you upgrade it up above to withstand historical hurricane force wind velocities, which that's where that comes from right there. All right, option number 7, use and maintenance of direct engine or right angle drives. We talked about that again. It's just a real small piece of equipment that usually only runs one piece of equipment. So again, not exactly. And one thing I want to point out, and let me see if I can't go the right direction here. It says this option is only available to existing facilities, but it may require more than one option to provide, and must still provide 20 PSI throughout the distribution system. So any option or options that you choose, the goal, and this is the Senate Bill 3 template, you still have to provide the 20 PSI for an indefinite amount of time until you get that normal power supply back, or whatever it is you need to do to maintain that 20 PSI. Some of these options from 7 to 13 say may require more than one option. They either say may or will. So it basically means you cannot just choose that option in and of itself by itself without combining it with another option and expect to get your EPP approved. But when it says may, you have a chance of possibly convincing the EPP program that yes, I can maintain 20 PSI off this one item, but they're going to be awfully suspicious. So just keep that in mind. Option number 8A, designation of the water system as a critical load facility. And again, that's through your electric provider to get that designation. And if you get that designation, you might have electricity where your water plant may not have if you didn't request that designation. So that could prevent you from losing power for greater than 24 hours and having to implement your EPP. Now, this is important. This will require more than one option. So you need to pair that with another option is what they're saying. You must, because it says will. All right. 8B, recognition of the water system as having redundant, isolated, or dedicated electrical feeds. We discussed that earlier, but this will require more than one option. So options 8A and 8B say will in terms of you have to combine it with another option. Option number 9, provide water storage capabilities. So you may have sufficient ground, elevated, or standpipe storage to provide your entire distribution system with 20 PSI during an extended power outage lasting more than 24 hours. But again, this option may need to be combined with another option because eventually you're going to run out of water. If you're not getting water filling the tanks and it lasts for a week or two, you may not be able to last that long. So that's why they're saying you may need to combine it with another option unless you can convince the EPP group otherwise. Option 10A, water is delivered to your distribution system from outside your service area using an emergency interconnect. So you could have a surface water plant that feeds pressure plane number 1. I've got groundwater wells that feed pressure plane number 2. But pressure plane number 3, that's kind of a weird little spot over here. And I can valve that area off, and then I have an emergency interconnect that I could open, and the person, the other entity or water system I have that interconnect with, has agreed to cover this pressure plane under their EPP, and they stated during an emergency that they will provide 20 PSI to that one area through the emergency interconnect. So that's a scenario in which you could use 10A, and I've already seen that several times. So it definitely is out there. So if you're using 10A just for that one pressure plane, you're going to be using other options. So I've seen some systems get up to about 4 or 5 options. Maybe they're getting critical load designation, they have redundant feeds, maybe they have portable generators, They can also get water delivered from another system through an emergency interconnect. And so the complicated systems can have a significant number of options. So option 10B, water is delivered to your distribution system from outside your service area using a water hauler. Now, water haulers can normally only put water into ground storage tank. So unless it's an elevated ground storage tank, you're probably going to need electricity to get water out of that tank. So again, this option may need to be combined with another option. Okay. Option 11, water has the ability, water system has the ability to provide water through artesian flows. Again, that's groundwater that just flows up under pressure. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that one. Option 12 is the redundant interconnectivity between pressure zones. So here it says an affected utility opens valves in one or more pressure zones within their system to provide water at 20 psi in all pressure zones throughout its entire distribution system. Essentially, you might be operating that as just one big pressure zone. But again, this option may need to be combined with another option, because if you're not getting any source water in, or let's say your wells or surface water plant don't have any power, well, you're going to run out of water eventually. Even if you're operating at one zone, eventually you're still going to have to get water. All right, option 13, use emergency water demand rules to maintain emergency operations. Again, an example of that could be implementing your drought contingency plan, which just might conserve or stretch out your water for a longer period of time, but is not going to last in perpetuity. Eventually, it's going to run out. So this option will need to be combined with other options. Okay. Then we have option number 14, any other alternative determined by the commission to be acceptable. So if you want to, maybe it doesn't fit all nice and neat into one of the other options, but it's close. Like for the permanently installed generators that are manual and not automatic in terms of the switchover capability, you might be able to propose that here. Now, I can't tell you if they're going to approve it or not, but if you want to propose something else that doesn't fit into the other options, this is where you would do that. So again, I know I skipped ahead to section 3. I think section 3 should be section 1. You should start out with the options first, because really before you start filling out the form, you need to know what options you're going to use for your EPP. So if you're a direct pressure system, probably one of the first things you need to do in conjunction with reading this form is contacting your water provider and see if they're going to put in writing that they're willing to cover your customers' connections at 20 psi during an emergency event. Okay. But again, you might have to have a little powwow with management, city council, board members to kind of get a consensus on what options you feel that affected utility is going to utilize for compliance with the EPP requirements. So once you figure that out, then I kind of recommend, then you can kind of go back to page 1. So again, not for Harrison, Fort Bend counties. All right. So assistance, here's our EPP help form. We went over that earlier. Haley and I deal with a lot of those requests, and we'll contact you. Here's your general information, water system name, PWS ID number, if you have a district number, what county you're in, your CCN number, which is your certificate of convenience and necessity. Currently, the Public Utility Commission issues those. And if you're not sure how to find that stuff, y'all can let us know, and we'll be happy to help you out. And it's going to ask for the owner, who prepared it, contact information, title. So now this kind of confuses people, this expected completion date. What they're asking is, for example, if you're going to get generators installed, whether they're permanent or portable, when do you plan to have that completed and have those operational? So expected completion date, look at that as the expected completion date to be able to implement your EPP. If you're making upgrades to meet the EPP requirements, when do you plan on having that completed? Now keep in mind, the deadline for completion is July 1st. So if you say, I'm going to get it done on June 1st, that could be your expected completion date if that's when you expect to have your generators up and operational. Now, the date isn't, the one date you don't want to put in there is, I'm going to say September 1st, 2022, and you don't have a 90-day extension in place. They're going to contact you with and probably have an issue with that, because if you're going to go past July 1st, you need to have a 90-day official extension in place. Options chosen. Obviously, you're not going to know that until you've read over the options. So that's why I recommend you read the options first. So this, again, the EPP program put this example together, so I kind of like it. So they actually chose and completed options 1, 2A, 2B, and then 3A, 4, 7, 9, 10A, and 13. All right. And so that's option, 1, choose your options. 2, give a short explanation of the proposed emergency preparedness plan. The example here in parentheses, using portable generator to power 2 out of the 3 wells. Just give a very brief description of the option or options that you're utilizing. And some other questions here. And I don't have time to go through every single little detail because it is 41 pages. And so down here, go ahead and sign in, put your title, date it, and updates to your EPP. So for example, let's say you choose I'm sorry, yes? Stephanie, did you say something or am I hearing things?
Nope, I didn't say anything.
Okay, sorry, I thought y'all had something for me. So right here, if you update your EPP, here's where you can kind of keep track of that. So let's say you choose the text warn example because you haven't secured funding for generators, but then, a year and a half down the road, you get the generators installed. We probably need to go ahead and update your EPP to reflect that and resubmit it to the Water Supply Division in the EPP program. But here's where you can kind of keep track of those updates. We've gone through applicability, extended power outages. So let's go to 1, and this is section 1. So we'll go to A. Describe your water system. Check all that apply. Are they residential? Do you serve residential connections, commercial connections, industrial connections, wholesale connections, or an institution? So an institution, in my opinion, is like a prison, for example. And under B, the EPP, is it for an existing or proposed system? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then 2 is going to be contact information for the system, okay? And so you want to put these in order of who you want contacted. So for example, Kieran Dunn, the first one here, that should be the primary. That's who you want contacted first, and then so on and so forth as you list subsequent people. List them in the order you want them contacted. They're going to want to know the location of your distribution maps, and you could say, oh, they're at the County Hall at 123 Main Street, Austin, Texas. And then so a diagram of your water system. And so I have a diagram, and so I'm going to pull that up here in a second, but let's read through this first. So submit a diagram of your drinking water system that shows all equipment. And so they have in parentheses what they want. You have to show all your sources, your surface water sources, groundwater sources, purchased water sources. All of your tanks have to be on the diagram. That would be your ground storage tanks, clear wells, standpipes, whatever it is, pressure tanks, and any of your pumps, your high service pumps, or your service pumps, booster pumps is another way to describe that. Any transfer pumps, just all of your pumps have to be on there. And show all of your treatment chemicals and any open or closed interconnects with other water systems. And so I created just a very, very basic one. You don't have to have an engineer design this. It doesn't have to be that fancy. I mean, the one I put together, it's similar to what the sketches that the region investigators put together. Pretty simple. So I'm going to kind of blow this up a little bit. And I just did one plan. And so I'm showing a closed valve there. and that's an interconnect with city of ABC, indicated it was normally closed. Put well number 1 on here, well number 2. You know, we got a ground storage tank, but I got the chlorine and then the ammonia. They're doing chloramines, and I just made this up, but ground storage tank, and then you have your service pumps. I put in here. It's got a hydropneumatic tank, and this is basically going out your distribution system. So I hit all of the bullets that needed to be covered. It can be this basic. So just keep that in mind. Quick and dirty little sketch there. So we'll keep going. Now, section 2 is going to be description of your water system. All right, so 1A is kind of right here. Does your water system have any groundwater wells? So if you're groundwater, you need to go ahead and list your TCEQ source ID. Okay, and that begins with G for groundwater, like a capital G, your PWS ID number, and then A. And so a lot of times that's going to be well number 1. When you drill another well and you call it well number 2, we're going to call it G PWS ID number B. And so that's a unique identifier to that well. And you can get that from going to Texas Drinking Water Watch. Okay. TCEQ has that information. If you haven't heard of Texas Drinking Water Watch, it will contain that information. So put the TCEQ source ID name. What's your designation of it is well number 1, well number 2. You can list what plant number it's at if you want to. List the address of the well location. And use during an emergency, yes or no. Do you anticipate using that during an emergency? Some systems may have 4 plants and they say, you know what, we can live along with 3 plants. So plant number 4 we're not going to use. And so then go ahead and list the pump capacity in gallons per minute. All right. So does your water system treat surface water or groundwater under the influence of surface water? So mainly for your surface water systems, your source ID number begins with an S, your PWS ID number, and then A. That could be intake number 1. And then you add another intake, it'll be S ID number, and then B, and so on and so forth. Owner's designation again, intake location, hopefully you got an address you can list there. Used during an emergency, yes or no? List the number of pumps and the total pump capacity at the intake. All right. And so C, do you purchase water or receive treated water? Yes or no? And there's 2 scenarios here. I is the affected utility a direct pressure system? We already kind of alluded to that. And in parentheses, it kind of describes it. Does the provider's water flow directly into your distribution system, not into a tank? Direct pressure systems generally have no tanks or pumps. And so II under C is, does the affected utility repressurize the water received from the provider? And so what that basically means, for example, it could air gap into a ground storage tank, then you repressurize it because you've got 2 service pumps, you know, you've got disinfection, you've got, you know, a pressure tank, and you've got an air compressor. So you just rely on them for water, not so much the pressure, because you purchase it, but you repressurize, you have tanks and all the equipment and facilities to do that. So if you're going to say yes to either of these scenarios, direct pressure or you repressurize, list who that provider is, okay? List their name. What is their PWS ID number? List a specific pressure plane if that's applicable. So here they put PP2. That's pressure plane number 2. It's usually how TCEQ names the pressure planes, just pressure plane 1, pressure plane 2. And the next question, will you rely on this provider for water during an emergency? It could be yes or no. If you're direct pressure, it's probably going to be a yes. And it could be yes or no if you repressurize. So the next question is very, very important. Will you rely on this provider for pressure at your customer's connections during an emergency? Yes or no? And so what that's asking is basically if you cleared this with your provider and if they agreed to provide you 20 PSI because you're a direct pressure system. So That's where you need to mark on your EPP, being the direct pressure system, that yes, I've contacted them. They sent me a letter stating that they would provide me 20 PSI during an emergency. Then you would mark yes there. And so for the capacity, that's usually going to be what's in your purchase water contract. So hopefully you have values in there that you can break down to gallons per minute and then indicate whether it's that valve or interconnect is normally open or closed. If it's your supply interconnect and you're under direct pressure, it's going to be open. If it's an emergency, it could be closed, normally. So treatment information, 2A, does your water system disinfect the water? Most do. Some might purchase and not need to re-disinfect the water. So that's why there's a yes or no. All water has to have a minimum residual, obviously. And let's see. Stephanie, do we have any questions or anything that we need to address? I just wanted to pause for a second.
We do have one that came in if you would like to answer it. It says, just out of curiosity, what's the penalty for those who are not in compliance by the implementation date of July 1st, 2022?
I can only speak to kind of how they handle things for Harrison Fort Bend County, because that's been around for 10 years. So they're in the process of figuring that out, but basically they're going to be tracking this in a database. And so eventually, if an EPP is not approved or they don't receive it, then they're eventually going to end up getting a notice of violation for not having an approved EPP after the deadline. And so eventually it could end up going through the formal enforcement process, which means they still have to resolve it and they could end up getting a financial penalty. So it could go to enforcement.
Okay, and that was the only question at this time, so we're free to move on.
Okay, excellent. All right, now for your disinfectants, obviously list chlorine there, list the location, in parentheses says plant name, and then the next column is disinfectant used during an emergency, yes or no. Again, you might not be using all your plants or anticipate using all your plants during an emergency, so they want to know what you're going to be using and what you're not going to be using. So type of disinfectant, is it liquid or is it a gas? A lot of folks still use gas chlorine, but a lot of folks are going to the liquid sodium hypochlorite. So just list whether you're using, the gas chlorine or the sodium hypochlorite, the liquid. And so obviously volume stored, gallons is for liquid, pounds is for gas. And so what they're asking there, days of storage under emergency demand, how many days of chemicals do you think you have? Like I've got, 250-pound chlorine cylinders, two extra ones, and I use, 100 pounds per day. Well, if you've got 300 pounds on site and you use 100 a day, that's only going to last you 3 days. Bad example. Hopefully you have more than that. But that's what they're trying to ask. You really just figure out how much of that chemical you think you're going to use per day, figure out how much you have on site, calculate that into number of days you think you have. And then the last one is electricity required to feed your disinfectant. Just answer yes or no based on your situation in your system. And so B, does your water system provide treatment other than disinfection? So yeah, you might be on chloramine, so you're feeding liquid ammonium sulfate, which is LAS, that's what that stands for. Or maybe it's anhydrous ammonia, or maybe you have other various chemicals that are not chlorine or disinfectants that you're feeding. And so it's really just going to ask you the same questions we just went over. It's just for anything that's not your disinfectant, just a different table. They asked, does your water system have any service or transfer pumps? And this is within the treatment process. So a transfer pump takes water from one point in the treatment process to point B in the treatment process. So these are not your booster pumps in distribution. So some surface water and groundwater systems do have booster pumps. Just list the pump, location and plant name. Are you going to use it in an emergency? And they ask for equipment directly before the pump, equipment directly after the pump. And so, for example, on a groundwater system, maybe they have a filtration system to get rid of iron and manganese. So the equipment directly before the pump could be, you know, the filter. And then after, well, maybe from there it pumps it out to distribution or pumps it to a ground storage tank, just whatever it is. But that's what they're kind of asking. And go ahead and list the pump capacity in gallons per minute. Y'all should know what those pumps are rated at. I know the region asks y'all for that when they're out there doing their inspections. Yeah, and then so 3A, does your water system have distribution pumps? That's where they're asking about your service pumps. All right, and so it's going to ask for kind of the same thing, but you know, pump 1 and 2 at pressure plane number 1, 402 Grafton Street. So they're just listing the pump, the location, and pressure plane. Pump used during an emergency, yes or no? That's kind of a common question. We've covered that. Equipment directly before the pump. Usually for a ground storage tank, that's always going to, for service pumps, it's always going to be a ground storage tank because it pulls suction from the ground storage tank. So equipment directly before pump, usually a ground storage tank. Equipment directly after pump could be an elevated tank, or it could just be the distribution system. I don't think there's really, you know, too many wrong answers there, but this has been confusing for people going over the form. It was confusing to me at first, but that's what they're trying to figure out. And they may actually remove that, what's before and after, whenever they revise the template sometime here in the near future. Okay, and so we hit B here. Does your water system have any finished water storage or pressurization tanks? And so list them all: tank type, elevated, hydropneumatic, which is your pressure tanks, ground storage tanks or standpipes. So here, that first one, GST, ground storage tank, you know, pressure plane 1, 402 Grafton for location and pressure plane. Tank used during an emergency. They said yes. And so equipment directly before pump, equipment directly after pump. You know what? That might be a typo, but let's just skip that one for now. And then the tank capacity. Right here, they list it in million gallons per day. So that GST 0.3 million gallons is basically 300,000 gallons. So if you want to list it in gallons or million gallons, I think that's fine. So if your system has more than one pressure plane or pressure zones, go ahead and list that under 4. And so pressure plane 1, 2, 1, 3. So they've got 3 different pressure planes, but the TCEQ source ID or provider PWS ID number. So you've got to list the sources for each pressure plane. That's why some of these are in here more than once. So pressure plane 1, those first 4, it's wells A, B, D, F, and G, it looks like. So anyways, plant name if applicable, you know. So just list pressure planes and essentially the sources and any of the plants. System demand. I think some of this information here needs to be revised because it doesn't make any, yeah, I think it's erroneous, unfortunately, but system demand, y'all are familiar with that. Under normal operations, y'all know what your average daily demand is, what your maximum daily demand is, and what your system capacity is. System capacity is going to be what's the total capacity of all your wells in gallons per minute. You can clock each one of them for a minute, 100 gallons per minute. And another one's 200 gallons per minute. You know, so that would be 300 gallons per minute. And if your surface water treatment plant, you know, you have your normal rated design flow of your surface water plant, and that's usually listed in million gallons per day. So you could have a 2.0 million gallon per day surface water treatment plant. And any of your purchased water sources, you're supposed to have a purchase water contract that lists the amount, which ideally can be broken down to gallons per minute. And you can go back and forth between gallons per minute and million gallons per day, but they're wanting to know what your system capacity is. That's what TCEQ figures out to make sure that you're meeting all your minimum capacity requirements. For example, like your production requirements, which is usually the 0.6 gallons per minute per connection. And then that's how they figure out whether or not you're in compliance with that production capacity requirement. So that's what they're trying to ask you about. And for the emergency operations, if you have data from the winter storm or a hurricane, you can put it there. A hurricane's usually going to be less than your normal operations, but the winter storm, for some, were 2.5 to 3 times higher. So if you have that data, put it in there for the emergency operations. There's really no wrong answer. Just don't leave it blank. And if you don't feel like you have any of that information, just take the average daily demand, maximum daily demand, and just divide it by 2. I've been told that's sufficient for the emergency operations. Now, system capacity, if you're not using all of your sources, then subtract their capacity off of that. In this example, it's 7.5 million gallons per day, but under emergency, it's 4.5 million gallons per day. So that indicates to me that some of their plants are not going to be utilized because that number is lower. So that's what they're kind of wanting to know. Remember the other questions asked you? Is this source going to be used during an emergency? Well, if you mark no, then subtract that off your capacity, and that's what that number is there. Okay, 6A is pretty important. System size. Does your water system sell or provide water to other water systems? Remember we talked about if you're a direct pressure system only, and we showed you where, yes, I'm going to rely on my provider during an emergency. And so here's where whoever you get your water from, if they're going to cover you under their EPP and your direct pressure system, here's where they would cover you. They would put your system name here, PWS-ID number. Is it normally open or closed? If you're direct pressure, it's going to be normally open. And will you provide 20 PSI throughout the receiver's distribution system during an emergency? Very important question. If your provider marks yes there, then they're saying that they're going to cover you under their EPP. Remember, if they say no here and don't cover you, then you may have to go the financial waiver route. And so that receiver is going to have to list the number of connections in the receiver's water system. That would be the direct pressure system that's receiving that water. How many connections and what is the population? If you know the connections, you can just take that and multiply it times 3 to get population. That's acceptable. And so B, number of connections and populations in each pressure plane in your water system. Go ahead and list that here. They've got 2 pressure planes. They list the number of connections and populations. Hopefully y'all can figure that out. Like at least the connections per pressure plane. And again, if you don't know the population, just multiply the connection count by 3. Yep, 3 pressure planes. Sorry, that went on to the next page there. So your power provider, just list who your power provider is. Who do you pay your electric bill to? And number 8, you may need to provide an electrical schematic. And so that says provide an electric schematic or diagram of your water system's emergency power facilities and the equipment, in parentheses, treatment, supply, pressure maintenance, etc., that is powered. So if you're going to use generators, you need to provide a little sketch showing what all is going to be powered. And there's a system diagram that was required earlier on in the section that we went over. So as long as you can read both of those requirements and get everything on one sketch, it's probably okay to do it all on one sketch. Just make sure that you cover everything that's required for both the schematic and the system diagram. And so other pertinent information, if there's something that you think is a little odd that the reviewer at TCEQ needs to know about your system so that the way that y'all chose the options makes a little more sense, please, by all means, use number 9. That one example where I've got, let's say I've got 2 groundwater plants and I've got a permanent generator at each, but it's a manual, it's not automatic. Well, if it's not automatic, you can't claim that under option 1. So maybe you're going to claim that under another option, or option number 5, or maybe even option number 14. Here's where you'd want to provide, an explanation of that. Well, each of those facilities is staffed 24/7 and 365 days a year. We've trained everyone on how to manually start that. Here's where you might, explain all of that and, hey, I talked to TCEQ and they didn't think it was going to work under option 1 because it didn't have the automatic switchover capabilities. So this is where you can find any other pertinent information that you want the reviewer to know. And providing a detailed explanation here could be the difference between your EPP getting approved or getting contacted for additional information. So we went over section 3 already. So we can just skip that. There's really no action. It's just informative. It just describes all the various options. And so when I talked about option 5, use of on-site electrical generation, maybe if your generator doesn't fit under option 1, you could try option 5, or maybe you need to propose something under option 14, which is any other alternative essentially approved by TCEQ. So it doesn't fit all nice and neat into the existing options, but you think it's going to be sufficient to supply that 20 PSI, here's where you would describe it. Now, option 4 is pretty important, okay? And so what option 4 is any option that you're going to choose, you're going to have to go and fill out that applicable option in section 4, okay? And so option 1 is the permanently installed auxiliary generators. All right, so you're going to have to provide information on that generator. So for example, it starts off by generator brand and model. You need to provide that information, and this is really important. The second column there is max power, parentheses kW or kilowatts, okay? Important. What type of electricity? What phase is it? 1, 2, or 3? The fuel type, is it diesel? Is it gasoline? Maybe it's natural gas. A lot of the larger generators, permanent ones, or I've heard of, seem to be diesel. So this is real important here. Automatic switch gear. Remember we said it's got to automatically sense that power failure and turn on. If you mark no there, it's very unlikely that your option 1 is going to get approved. But again, if it doesn't have that automatic switch, maybe it could somehow fit somewhere else, but you may want to see what the upgrades would be to get that automatic switch gear installed. And I get the impression on the larger ones, it can be fairly substantial. So again, facility staff, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, yes or no? Most are not. Your large surface water plants, a lot of those are. So what you're going to have to do in this next column, list all facilities and treatment units that will be powered during an emergency. And so they pre-populated some of this, but so in this scenario, wells 4, let's see, wells 4 here, marked it, but you need the power requirement for each facility and treatment unit power. So they said well pump number 4, 113.7 kilowatts. So you're going to have to list the power requirements. So we got booster pump 1 is about 34 kilowatts, booster pump 2 about 32 kilowatts. So disinfection equipment 0.5 kilowatt, treatment equipment 0.5 kilowatt. Maybe if you got an air compressor for your pressure tank, you'd list that there. The point being is they're going to add all this stuff up. And if you add all this stuff up over here, and let's say you got a 265 kilowatt generator that you listed over here to the left, if all this stuff adds up to 300 kilowatts, then that means this generator is not big enough and your EPP is not going to get approved. Now, maybe you made a typo on the kilowatts, but they should point that out and question that to see if you sized it appropriately. Because if it's too small, it's not going to do you any good. Doesn't have that output in kilowatts that you need, not going to be super helpful. And so you may have different plants, and so there's other spaces here. So they're going to want to know what the fuel location is, the physical address, probably at the plant, but maybe not. Fuel resupply, how much fuel is stored on site? This example was 1,000 gallons. How much fuel does a generator use per hour? We'll go over that. You can use attachment C to figure that out. So depending on how many kilowatts per hour it's sized for, you can figure out how many gallons per hour it's going to use. And it's 7% of the kilowatt hours, for example. So if it's a 100 kilowatt generator, it's going to use 7 gallons per hour. 7% is the fuel consumption in gallons per hour. So just remember that 7% of the kilowatt hours. And so in this scenario, how many gallons per hour? They said it's going to use 18.1 gallons per hour. So we have option 2A here. Remember, that's like if you're a direct pressure system and you're going to rely on your water provider during an extended power outage. We'll list that provider's name. Hopefully they covered you in their EPP like I showed you earlier. List their ID number, which pressure plane, if applicable. Will you rely on this provider for water to a tank during an emergency? Yes or no? So if you repressurize, maybe you're still going to get water from them during the emergency, but you're going to have a generator to repressurize your own water. Will you rely on this provider for water to a tank during an emergency? No, if you're a direct pressure system. So it just depends on whether you're direct pressure or not. Now, will you rely on this provider for pressure at your customer's connections during an emergency? If you're a direct pressure system and you mark yes here, that means that that other entity has agreed to cover you in their EPP. At least that's the way that I look at it. So how these options are set up, under section 4, you're going to have to provide information. Then there's usually documentation that they're going to want. And so A, for example, is your water system solely relying on a provider for emergency operations? If you mark yes, you need to submit documentation here. So you know, for example, for the documentation, if you're a direct pressure system and you're claiming that your provider is going to cover you under their EPP and say that they're going to provide you 20 PSI to your customers' taps, provide a copy of the contract with your provider that includes the language that they're guaranteeing 20 PSI throughout your distribution system or specific pressure point. It could be in your purchase water contract. I kind of doubt it, but it's possible. Maybe they've sent you a letter. Your provider has sent you a letter including language guaranteeing 20 PSI throughout your distribution system. So it could be a letter. Or if that provider submits their EPP before you submit yours as the direct pressure system, pages from the provider's EPP, which includes the connection count for your system or pressure planes in the provider's connection count. So remember where I said the provider has to cover you under their EPP, and it's going to list the direct pressure system's name and ID number, and they're saying, yes, I will provide 20 PSI. If you can provide that information from that page, hopefully, or other pages if applicable, that's what they're talking about. Show us the parts of their EPP where they say they're going to cover you. Or you can do an engineering study or hydraulic analysis. And so there's other questions here. We're going to keep going. Again, we got kind of a lot of ground to cover. And then option 2B, contributing member of text 1. Remember I said contributing, you have to member has identified needed resources to the text 1 system, and you're going to have installation of quick connect system is required with this option. And so the example, if you're going to use the contributing member of text 1, which means you offer up a resource, but you also identify what resources you need, provide a copy of the following: a copy of the text 1 membership profile page. That's when you create your username and password and you're kind of logging on, going through that process. It's going to be something called the membership profile page. So get a copy of that, a snip, a picture, something like that, just to document that. And then a copy of the mutual aid agreement with text 1. And that's applicable to investor-owned or privately owned water systems. And so with that said, what I'd like to do is, well, real quick, you're going to have to provide generator information. So may not know the model name, understood, because that's something that you may request down in the future. In this scenario, they know that they need 200 kilowatts. Quick connect installed, yes. So in other words, it has to be wired up for that generator to come out there and be hooked up pretty quickly, because it's not a permanently installed generator. You're just going to be bringing out that temporarily. So you have to have all the electrical set up so you're not looking for an electrician during an emergency. And so these are very similar to what we've already gone over for these other columns, so I'm not going to go over there. But what I wanted to do So we've talked about text warn, and we've talked about option 3A, negotiation of leasing and contracting agreements. So again, go ahead and provide a signed copy of the agreement for the generator company and the fuel company. And you're going to have to list your generator specifications just like we did in the other example. And it's going to have a quick connect installed, because again, it's not going to be permanently installed. You're going to bring it out temporarily until you don't need it anymore, then return it. So you got to have the electrical already set up so you're not scrambling around during an emergency. Pretty self-explanatory. It has the same fuel question, so we've already covered that. And so 3B, mutual aid agreement with another water provider. So if you're going to use this, here's the documentation you need to provide with your EPP. Name of the water system or group that you have a mutual aid agreement with. And so you're going to need to provide a copy of the mutual aid agreement from each water provider. Then you're going to have to highlight the area in the agreement that lists the resources to be provided by the water system. And again, you're going to have to provide the generator specifications, and it's going to have to be installed with the quick connect. And if it hasn't been installed yet and you mark no, you're going to have to list the date that it's going to be installed. And so again, it's going to ask you for the generator information that we've already covered. So what I wanted to do real quick is we're going to take a break here in a couple minutes, but I wanted to go to the TextWarn website, because that can be a resource if you want to go the mutual aid route, or if you want to be a contributing member of TextWarn. So there's a couple options here that can tie into this TextWarn, so bear with me. Again, I just went to Google and put in TextWarn, TXWARN, and Haley's probably already dropped a link in there if I had to guess in the Q&A. So here is the TextWarn webpage. And so if you would like to register with TextWarn, let's say you want to choose option 2B, I believe that's what it is, the contributing member of TextWarn. Well, that means you're going to have to sign up. And see this register in the top right? You can click on that. And that's how you would register. So member type, do you want to be water, just wastewater? And by the way, EPPs only apply to water systems. They do not apply to wastewater. So keep that in mind. We've gotten that question quite a bit. EPP only applies to water systems. So there's where you register. And if you want to learn more about mutual aid agreements, you can click here. And they talk about mutual aid agreements. And so if you are a public entity like a city, municipality, county, things of that nature, there's a statewide mutual aid agreement that the legislature passed back in 2007, and that applies to those public entities. It does not cover private entities. And so, for example, if you're a privately owned water system by a for-profit corporation or an individual, they kind of nickname those investor-owned utilities. That's what the PUC has direct jurisdiction over for their rates, by the way. But if you're one of those systems, then you have to complete this mutual aid agreement, which I just clicked on, and then submit that back to TextWarn to be a member. So you can read through this. It's only 5 pages long, and then pretty much towards the end, you got to put your information in here. So you got to complete that and then email it back to TextWarn. But if you want to learn more about mutual aid agreements and you're thinking you're interested in that option, but your mutual aid agreement pretty much needs you to get a generator. I mean, unless you can figure out some other way that's going to help you maintain 20 PSI without a generator. But generally speaking, general rule of thumb, it means someone's going to give you a generator. Okay. But again, good resource here for TextWarn for the mutual aid agreements. Right on their homepage, there's that button right there for the mutual aids. All right. So again, contributing member of TextWarn, 2B, put your generator information in here, because that's essentially what you're going to have to do. And a lot of these other ones, option 3A, leasing agreements, again, being a little redundant here, fill out the generator information. All these are still going to tie back to possibly still needing a generator, a lot of these options, but you don't necessarily have to have it on site, I guess is the benefit, which could be a big cost saving. So again, mutual aid agreement, provide documentation like you do for all of these options under Section 4, list the generator information, which we've already gone through. Again, it's got to have the Quick Connect installed so you can use it on short notice. Number 4, use of portable generators capable of serving multiple facilities, and these have to be wired at your plant, equipped with the Quick Connect systems. Again, generator information. If you're sharing it with other systems, you're going to have to provide some information on that. Again, list your generator specifications, and we've covered all of this stuff in the previous examples. Fuel information. Option number 5, on-site electrical generation. If you're going to be doing solar, wind, hydroelectric, they're going to ask you information similar to what the generator tables were in terms of the other options. So we've kind of already covered that. Fuel information, if applicable. Hardening the electric transmission and distribution system, serving the water system. They're going to want you to have some sort of description of what you're doing. Go ahead and list a diagram and just go and read the diagram information there at the bottom. I don't know how many people are going to be using this. People may be down by the coast, but if you're not by the coast, probably not that applicable. But if you'd like more information, a lot of information here, so I know I'm going fast. Option number 7, use and maintenance of direct engine or right angle drives, a small piece of equipment that's only going to operate one piece of equipment like a well, something like that. Similar information, but this differs a little bit. Brand and model, okay, those were covered before. Max power, you can either list it in horsepower or kilowatts. It also asks for the revolutions per minute and what type of fuel, and list all the facility treatments units that are unpowered. Okay, so this is a little bit different, but power requirements of each facility or treatment unit, circle appropriate unit. Okay, so list all facilities and treatment units, power, and then list the power requirements of each facility and treatment unit. So that was similar to everything else. Well pump, number 1, 300 kilowatts. So again, similar to the other sections, but that one varied just a little bit because I talk about horsepower and revolutions per minute. So designation of your water system as a critical load facility. Again, this will require more than one option. There's a lot of documentation that you have to provide, so who is your electric provider? And then a copy of the letter or email, basically with that designation. And they're going to want a diagram of your system showing all equipment listed under Section 2. And so again, you can read through this if you're interested in this, but I mean, you still have to pair this with another option, and more than likely you would have to pair this with an option 1 through 6. I don't know if you can pair this with another option 7 through 13. I think the EPP program is still in the process trying to figure out which pairings they're going to allow. So you'll have to be patient with TCEQ and development of some of the policy. We just wanted to get out sooner rather than later to get y'all thinking about some of this. Well, I may not have all the answers right now, but hopefully down the road we will. And so I wanted to focus on B for this critical load. So they want to know, basically indicate all the facilities that are included in critical load status. And so if that plant gets a designation, list the plant, water treatment plant number 1 or water treatment plant number 2. But list the address to electric meter providing power to the plant. Then list all the facilities and treatment units that have critical load status that are at that plant. So your sources need to be listed here: pumps, disinfection, treatment equipment, air compressor. So this part's similar to some of the other tables that we've gone over, but a little bit different. So that's for critical load. So if you have numerous plants, it gives you additional tables to fill out if needed. So option 8B, designation of the water system as having redundant, isolated, or dedicated electrical feeds. If you have dual power feeds and you want to list this on your form, you can. But again, it has to be combined with another option. So A, there's going to be documentation that they want. And then B is the table that you fill out. And this is essentially going to be the same table that was in the previous option that we just went through for critical load status. So these two tables are pretty much the same. Again, if you have multiple treatment plants, they have multiple tables here. So that's why I'm scrolling through it. Stephanie, do we have any questions right now about what I've done so far?
No questions at the moment.
Okay. So then option number 9, provide water storage capabilities. You can choose this one if you want, but more than likely they're going to make you pair that with another option. So if you're interested in that, you can kind of read through this and see if I can hit the highlights. So you're going to have to explain under A how the water in the storage will flow to customers and how it will be replenished. So if all you have is a bunch of ground storage and you're like, well, I don't really have a good answer for that. Well, then that means that you're going to need electricity to get it to distribution system. So unlikely that it will get approved. But maybe you have elevated storage. And so gravity is going to basically, that's how the water is going to flow to your customers. Or maybe you have an elevated ground storage tank. So you might be able to get away with, if you had an elevated ground storage tank and you had a bunch of additional storage and you had enough water haulers that could actually go pump water into that elevated tank, then you might be able to pair this option with that obtaining water from outside your service area for water haulers. So there's some other information here y'all can read through. And they're also going to want to know, please choose other options to ensure your utility can maintain 20 PSI if your electric provider fails to provide your facility with power during an outage lasting more than 24 hours. So again, they kind of want you to pair this with another option. So that's what they're doing right here, is asking for that other option that you're going to use. And so here's a diagram here. They're going to want to know the useful storage capacity of their tank. Anything down below the pump is going to be dead storage, and they're not going to get credit for anything over the overflow elevation, which kind of makes sense. So they're going to want that information if you decide to utilize this option. So option 10A, water is delivered to your distribution system from outside your service area using emergency interconnects. This is where you can list that information. I gave that scenario about one little area on your system can be served through an emergency interconnect, but y'all might have generators to power everything else or use some other appropriate option. Here's where you'd list that PWS ID number and name of who you have that interconnect with, and where does that system obtain its water from. In this example, 10 groundwater wells, and connections served, list the number of connections that are going to be served. And there's some documentation that has to be submitted under B. And they're going to want a copy of the agreement ensuring the 20 PSI. And list storage tanks that have an air-gapped interconnect. If you have any, if that's applicable, you can fill that out. And then they're going to ask you questions about compatibility of the disinfection. If you're on free chlorine, but they're on chloramines, that's going to be a problem if those start mixing. So they're going to ask you questions about that. So you can kind of read through that. Option 10B, water is delivered to your distribution system from outside your service area using a water hauler. So I apologize, I referenced that option earlier, but I hadn't gotten to it yet. So if you can use a TCEQ approved water hauler, and each water hauler has their own PWS ID number, and again, they have to be approved by us, and they're only authorized to haul potable water. This might work on a small scale, but that other scenario is you had a bunch of elevated ground storage, and if you can get enough water haulers lined up, you might be able to survive, until your power supply comes back on by using those two options. an approved water hauler, and then that water storage capability. It's possible, not super likely, but again, a lot of this stuff that you're going to have to pair, because again, it says this option may need to be combined. Any option that's 7 through 13, more than likely you're going to have to combine it with another option, and more than likely it would be an option 1 through 6, some of the earlier options that we went through. So provide the PWS ID number, which you can get through Texas Drinking Water Watch. Let's see, B, list all the different list all water providers utilized by the water hauler and the type of disinfectant used by each provider to ensure compatibility with disinfection protocol. You do not want to be mixing free chlorine and chlorines if you can avoid it. You want to only mix the same type, whether they're both free chlorine or they're both chloramines. That's the only ones you want to mix. You don't want to mix free chlorine with chloramines. And on C, explain how the water hauler will pump from the water hauler into the storage tank. Usually they have a permanently mounted pump on the back of the water hauling truck, but you probably want to confirm that if you're going to utilize this option. And then list which storage tanks under D will be filled by the hauler. And then explain how the water will be pumped from the storage tank into the distribution system. You know, obviously, if you don't have any type of elevated ground storage, and you're not going to get a water hauler to pump into an elevated tank. I don't think that's possible due to the elevation above ground level. And so they're just going to want to know, I mean, so just provide that necessary information. More questions. I think they're kind of a hesitant option that they're allowing you to use, hence all the questions. So you can just go through those, and if you're not sure what some of the questions are, just let us know. The artesian flows, I'm not even going to go over that one. I'm not sure if that's even going to be utilized, but if for some reason you want to utilize it, you can definitely let us know if you have some questions. Option number 12, redundant interconnectivity between pressure zones. Again, not a standalone option, may need to be combined. And so you're going to have to explain how the water will flow to customers with one or more pressure zones and how it will be replenished with or without electricity. So that's kind of, they're alluding that, yes, you kind of need to combine this with something else. B is just the documentation that they're going to request here. C, they're going to want you to choose potentially another option to pair with this option. Talked about a hydraulic study, possibly. Option 13, use emergency water demand rules to maintain emergency operations. You cannot use this as a standalone. This option will need to be combined with another option because that doesn't guarantee you maintaining 20 PSI. Because if you implement your drought contingency plan, but you're not replenishing the source, eventually you're going to run out if it's an extended power outage. And I don't mean just extended well beyond, you know, several days. Now, you can list your water use restrictions here in this table, or if you just want to attach your drought contingency plan, see in the example, please see attached drought plan. So don't think you have to fill all this stuff in. If you just want to attach your plan, that's fine. But again, you're going to have to pair this with another option, preferably something option 1 through 6. Number 14, any other alternative determined by the commission to be acceptable. They're going to ask you to clarify that and provide a statement and essentially describe that. But I wanted to point this out. The following methods would not be acceptable options. Evacuation. If you're an affected utility, you have to complete the EPP. A lot of entities would say, well, we'll just shut down. Well, unfortunately, that's not an option. Okay. Providing bottled water. In lieu of providing 20 PSI in the distribution system, that's not an acceptable alternative. You can't say, well, we're just going to run out of water in the distribution system, but I'll provide bottled water. That's not acceptable. If you happen to be on a boil water notice, but you're limping along a little bit over 20 PSI and you want to provide bottled water, you can do that, but you can't provide bottled water and say that's my response to this emergency situation. I'll provide bottled water until the power comes back on. Not acceptable. So another thing that's not acceptable is relying on your provider without the documentation that states the provider will provide your system with 20 PSI throughout your distribution system. If your EPP has to match up with the provider, and the provider has to agree to provide you with that 20 PSI. And again, if you're a direct pressure system and you don't have that documentation, well, then you may have to go the financial waiver route if that provider is not willing to cover your system in their EPP. So with that said, this is a good breaking point. So real quick, let me just summarize this. Section 4 is by far the longest section because look how many, we went through more than 14 options because there's an A and B. Just know for section 4 that whatever applicable option you have, go to that applicable option in section 4 and make sure you complete all the information that's required for that specific option. Okay, and again, that's why this template is so long. Stephanie, is there any questions we need to address?
No, no questions at this time.
Okay, are we going to post that quiz here shortly for the CEU credit?
Yes, I can go ahead and post it if you'd like me to.
Yeah, let's do that. And let me just make another reminder. If you want continuing education credit, which is up to 4 hours, and that's only for an active water license, there's 2 things you need to do. You need to fill out the attendance form that was posted in the Q&A, and that was posted by Stephanie, and it was should have been the very first thing that was posted. So make sure if you haven't already that you click on that and complete that. Make sure you hit submit because that needs to get to our group here at TCEQ. Then she's going to post the quiz, and I think it's 3 very easy questions. And so you need to also complete that quiz and submit it. So the 2 things that we need to issue that credit is the attendance form and then the quiz, and they're both posted in the Q&A.
And I also posted a survey for the webinar as well. So the survey is the second to last link. The last link will be that training quiz.
Yeah, and please give us your feedback if you care to on the webinar. We'd love to hear from you and get your feedback, and always continually trying to improve. So with that said, Stephanie, I guess I'll turn it over to you to lead us into our last break.
Okay, with the time being 4:01, we'll come back at 4:11 and we'll wrap up the rest of the webinar. Y'all have a good break.
All right, this is Alex. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So again, we completed section 4 there, which is the longest section. But I wanted to take y'all to Texas Drinking Water Watch because I keep saying, hey, this information is in Texas Drinking Water Watch. But I guess before that, it doesn't look like we have any questions, do we, Stephanie?
No, there are no questions.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go pull up Texas Drinking Water Watch and show you where you can find a lot of this information that has to go on the EPP form. So Texas, and I'm just going to Google right now, Texas Drinking Water Watch. There's kind of a lot of clicks you got to do, but public drinking water for TCEQ. First thing that pops up, I'm going to click on that. Texas Drinking Water Watch. Okay. I'm just going to pick on the city of Beaumont just because I used to work there. They're a real good example because they have groundwater and surface water. The city of Beaumont, and they're fairly large, probably 100,000 or so. So let me go back. Sorry, I'm so used to going fast. So I searched for Beaumont. So if you know the PWSID number, you can put that in there too. I actually just searched for Beaumont, but if you search by name, it can end up pulling a lot of stuff, but I'm looking for City of Beaumont. So it's 1230001 is the PWSID number. So this is kind of their main screen here. Let me see if I can adjust the sizes here. Yeah, that's probably good enough here. So up here, do y'all see water system facilities? I'm going to click on that. And Stephanie, how does it look? Does it look okay in terms of the size of the font?
Yeah, I think it looks good to me.
Okay. So I'm going to click on water system facilities up here, top left. Remember how we talked about the source codes? Y'all see here, intake 1, an S123001A. That correlates to intake 1. B, intake 2, C, intake 3. So for example, but this one, I don't think is active because it's got an I here. So you may have trouble deciphering some of these codes, but we can definitely help y'all. Active and permanent, active and emergency. So these right here. So anyways, here's, you know, if you're trying to get the source codes, you're not sure what they are. And see, they also have groundwater wells. So they have G123001A correlates to well 1. Let's see, D is well 2. But again, anything with kind of an I over here, probably not active. But A and P, you got wells, source code A and D. So that's where you can get the information. And it's probably pretty good when you're filling out this form to have it, someone at TCEQ that's cross-referencing the information on the EPP form with Texas Drinking Water Watch. Hopefully the stuff matches up. So when you see a TP here, those are the treatment plants. So they have plant GWP. So that would be a groundwater plant right there. This other TP treatment plant, SWTP, surface water treatment plant, Pine Street. Both active, permanent. And so they'll list all of their tanks, like here's a 2 million gallon elevated located on Dishman. Lucas, 1.5 million gallon elevated, which is EL. GR, usually ground storage, 5 million gallons. Pumping facilities, so we list a lot of their service pumps because we asked you all for gallons per minute. So a lot of that information you're going to fill out, you can find here in Texas Drinking Water Watch, especially early on in the form, and then it asks for more information under section 4 for facilities, for example, that are going to be powered. So you kind of hopefully what you put on your form is pretty close to what it has in here for what information is being requested. They have more information here in Drinking Water Watch than you need, so you got to kind of know how to wade through it. But if you have trouble kind of interpreting some of this stuff, myself or Haley are fairly knowledgeable about this because we both have worked in the region office as inspectors in the past, so we can help y'all out with this. But a lot of this information you can get out of Texas Drinking Water Watch. And again, I chose the city of Beaumont just because they are a good example because they have surface water and they had groundwater and it has their source codes and whatnot, and basically has kind of what we have on file for the name of their plants and where their tanks are, and it would list pressure tanks also if they had pressure tanks. That gets listed here. So with that said, do we have any questions, Stephanie?
Nope, no questions.
Okay, sounds good. So now we've essentially gone through probably the meat of what the EPP is. So not only do you have to kind of choose the various options, provide basic information on your system, but this can also be used as a tool where you do have an emergency and you come back. And so that's what kind of some of these latter sections are. So it picks back up. So what you want to do is you go through and you fill out the appropriate options. So if you're only choosing option 1, which is the permanently installed generators, fill that part out in section 4. If that's the only option you're choosing, skip down to section 5 now. You don't have to pay attention to the rest of that section because again, it's by far the longest section, section 4 on the EPP. And again, choose the applicable option, provide that necessary information and documentation that's requested in section 4. But if you're only doing a couple options, once you complete those options, skip on over to section 5. And it's going to talk about emergency communications. So there's a lot of information that they're going to ask you about, you know, the fire department, police department, and any of the local stuff that's going to be blank, go ahead and populate that in. Please do not leave it blank. Any of the statewide stuff we were able to populate. because 252 counties, just not feasible to populate the local information. So county judge, and so if it's blank on your template, go ahead and fill it in. But again, this is just emergency contacts, and there's quite a few here, but take a little time to get all that information. Still continuing. Local contact notification list. These I view these somewhat maybe to be critical facilities are probably in here too, like hospitals, nursing homes, list for pharmacies. So just do the best you can to complete this information and be under section 5. Chemical suppliers, list the information for your chemical suppliers in case you need to contact them and you're not scrambling around trying to figure out what their phone number is. And so it just gives you the opportunity to kind of consolidate a lot of your contact information in one place that you may need during an emergency event. Certified laboratory. This one's kind of important because they have 2 spots for it. So you want to list a primary lab and then list a backup, because when we had that winter storm, some of the labs were closed. Well, if you're trying to, lift a boil water notice and you're waiting on your coliform samples, but yet you don't have a lab to take it to, go ahead and take the time before you're in an emergency to find a backup lab and just put their information here. And that's in table D. Fuel supplier contact information. If you're needing diesel, go ahead and list that contact information. And utility contacts, this is for your other utilities, electric, gas, sewer, telephone, maybe your wholesale provider. And let's see, G, any of your bulk water suppliers, that would be your water haulers, because you can use that as one of the options in combination with another option. So if you're going to utilize water haulers, you can list their information here. Bottled water sources, you're not required to provide bottled water, but if you care to put that information here, you're welcome to. Media notification list. And when you issue a boil water notice, how do you issue that? Do you do it through the newspaper? Or do you do it through the radio, through the television? If so, go ahead and list that information here so you have it handy in case you have an emergency situation. Okay, attachment A, submitting the completed EPP. So once you've gone through this entire template, figured out your options, completed everything that you needed to complete, you need to submit it. What is the submission date? March 1st. Unless you request an extension, that can be up to 90 days, but you only get one extension for either deadline. So there's 2 ways that you can submit your completed EPP. You can email it to the EPP email address, which we've pointed out numerous times, or you can mail it. Choose one or the other and not both. So it clearly states not both. That just creates confusion if you email it, then you send a certified copy through the regular mail. Just choose one or the other. And if you're going to mail it, here's the Water Supply Division and their address to send that EPP to. And again, if you need assistance, here's another link to the EPP help form. Now this is important. As part of the requirements for Senate Bill 3, you are going to be required to distribute your approved plan and your TCEQ approval letter. When TCEQ approves this, they will send you an official letter, basically stating as such. And so where it has to be distributed, and this is not necessarily a TCEQ requirement that we came up with, this is out of Senate Bill 3, needs to go to your county judge. And that's a copy of the approved plan and the approval letter from TCEQ. Send it to your county judge, list the date, how you distribute it. The County Office of Emergency Management. In rural areas, the county judge and the emergency management manager may be one and the same, but they may not be. You also need to send it to the Public Utility Commission of Texas. And they don't have an email address. They call it a filing. And so this is probably going to be a confidential filing, but you can read that information. They list an address there too. If you have questions, there's where you can call. Excuse me. So let's see. And then the last place you have to send it is to the Texas Division of Emergency Management. And they actually have an email address and they have a mailing address. If you got questions about how to get it to them, they have it right there. So this definitely has to be done to be in compliance with the EPP requirement. So obviously you're going to do this after you submit it to TCEQ, but go back and update your plan once you've completed that, because again, remember the region investigators are going to be looking at this stuff. So if you didn't do that, they could potentially point that out as an issue. Okay. Moving along here, an attachment B, that's not anything you need to do, but if you need to access TCEQ public notices like you're going to issue or rescind a boil water notice or need the certificate of delivery or whatever it is, that's really just kind of a link. So you have that in your EPP in case you need to access that information. So not really anything you need to do here, more informational than anything else. Now we talked about the generator and how many gallons per hour that it uses. And there's other generator information here, but it's in the comments at the bottom. So I'm going to blow this up. Might be a little fuzzy, but second sentence under comments there, right here, fuel consumption is estimated at 7% of the kilowatt usage. So the example that we used, 100 kilowatt generator, they say 7% of the kilowatt usage is the gallons per hour. So 7% of 100 is 7. So 100 kilowatt generator will use approximately 7 gallons per hour. And so you're going to need that conversion when filling out the EPP if you're going to be using generators. All right, let me get that back down to a reasonable size. Here's just a recovery checklist in case you need to use it once you come back and evaluate your system after an emergency event. So just if you care to use it, it's here. There's nothing y'all really have to fill out for that to get your EPP approved. And if you're kind of curious about how state assistance requests work, that's really just kind of describes that process. And that is the end of the template. So there still is some stuff in section 5 and beyond that you still have to kind of complete: contact information, lab information,